Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War. The Cold War is called cold because it supposedly never heated up into actual armed conflict, which means, that it wasn't a war.
Mr. Green, but if the war on Christmas is a war and the war on drugs is a war...
You're not going to hear me say this often in your life, me from the past, but that was a good point. At least the Cold War was not an attempt to make war on a noun, which almost never works because nouns are so resilient. And to be fair, the Cold War did involve quite a lot of actual war, from Korea to Afghanistan, as the world's two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, sought ideological and strategic influence throughout the world. So perhaps it's best to think of the Cold War as an era, lasting roughly from 1945 to 1990. Discussions of the Cold War tend to center on international and political history, and those are very important, which is why we've talked about them in the past. This, however, is United States history, so let us heroically gaze, as Americans so often do, at our own navel. Stan, why did you turn the globe to the green parts of not America? I mean, I guess to be fair, we were a little bit obsessed with this guy. So the Cold War gave us great spy novels, independence movements, and arms race cool movies like Dr. Strangelove and War Games, one of the most evil mustaches in history. But it also gave us a growing awareness that the greatest existential threat to human beings is ourselves. It changed the way we imagine the world and humanity's role in it. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, William Faulkner famously said, "Our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up?" So today we're going to look at how that came to be the dominant question of human existence and whether we can ever get past it. So after World War II, the US and the USSR were the only two nations with any power left. The United States was a lot stronger. We had atomic weapons, for starters, and also the Soviets had lost 20 million people in the war, and they were led by a sociopathic, mustachioed Joseph Stalin. But the US still had worries. We needed a strong, free market-oriented Europe, and to a lesser extent Asia, so that all the goods we were making could find happy homes. The Soviets, meanwhile, were concerned with something more immediate, a powerful Germany invading them again. Germany, and please do not take this personally, Germans, was very, very slow to learn the central lesson of world history: do not invade Russia, unless you're the Mongols. So at the end of World War II, the USSR encouraged the creation of pro-communist governments in Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, which was a relatively easy thing to encourage because those nations were occupied by Soviet troops. The idea for the Soviets was to create a communist buffer between them and Germany, but to the US it looked like communism might just keep expanding, and that would be really bad for us because who would buy all of our sweet, sweet industrial goods? So America responded with the policy of containment, as introduced in diplomat George F. Kennan's famous Long Telegram. Communism could stay where it was, but it would not be allowed to spread. And ultimately, this is why we fought very real wars in both Korea and Vietnam. As a government report from 1950 put it, the goals of containment were: 1. Block further expansion of Soviet power; 2. Expose the falsities of Soviet pretensions; 3. Induce a retraction of the Kremlin's control and influence; and 4. In general, foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet system. Harry Truman, who, as you'll recall, became president in 1945 after Franklin Delano Prez for Life Roosevelt died, was a big fan of containment, and the first real test of it came in Greece and Turkey in 1947. This was a very strategically valuable region because it was near the Middle East, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but the United States has been just like a smidge interested in the Middle East the last several decades because of oil, glorious oil! Right, so Truman announced the so-called Truman Doctrine because, why not name a doctrine after yourself, in which he pledged to support, quote, freedom-loving peoples against communist threats, which is all fine and good, but who will protect us against peoples, the pluralization of an already plural noun? Anyway, we eventually sent $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, and we were off to the Cold War races. The Truman Doctrine created the language through which Americans would view the world, with America as free and communists as tyrannical. According to our old friend Eric Foner, the speech set a precedent for American assistance to anti-communist regimes throughout the world, no matter how undemocratic, and for the creation of a set of global military alliances forces directed against the Soviet Union. It also led to the creation of a new security apparatus, the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Atomic Energy Commission, all of which were somewhat immune from government oversight and definitely not democratically elected. And the containment policy and the Truman Doctrine also laid the foundations for a military buildup, an arms race, which would become a key feature of the Cold War. But it wasn't all about the military, at least at first. Like, the Marshall Plan was first introduced at Harvard's commencement address in June 1947 by, get this, George Marshall, in what turned out to be like the second most important commencement address in all of American history. Yes, Stan, okay. It was a great speech, thank you for noticing. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The Marshall Plan was a response to economic chaos in Europe brought on by a particularly harsh winter that strengthened support for communism in France and Italy. The plan sought to use U.S. aid to combat the economic instability that provided fertile fields for communism. As Marshall said, "Our policy is not directed against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." Basically, it was a New Deal for Europe, and it worked. Western Europe was rebuilt so that by 1950, production levels in industry had eclipsed pre-war levels, and Europe was on its way to becoming a US-style capitalist mass consumer society, which it still is. Kind of. Japan, although not technically part of the Marshall Plan, was also rebuilt. General Douglas MacArthur was basically the dictator there, forcing Japan to adopt a new constitution, giving women the vote, and pledging that Japan would forswear war, in exchange for which the United States effectively became Japan's defense force. This allowed Japan to spend its money on other things, like industry, which worked out really well for them. Meanwhile, Germany was experiencing the First Berlin Crisis. At the end of the war, Germany was divided into East and West, and even though the capital, Berlin, was entirely in the east, it was also divided into east and west. This meant that West Berlin was dependent on shipments of goods from West Germany through East Germany, and then in 1948, Stalin cut off the roads to West Berlin. So the Americans responded with an 11-month-long airlift of supplies that eventually led to Stalin lifting the blockade in 1948 and building the Berlin Wall, which stood until 1991 when Kool-Aid got... No, wait. That wasn't when the Berlin Wall was built. That was in 1961. I just wanted to give Thought Bubble the opportunity to make that joke. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So right, the wall wasn't built until 1961, but 1949 did see Germany officially split into two nations, and also the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, and NATO was established, and the Chinese Revolution ended in communist victory. So by the end of 1950, the contours of the Cold War had been established. West versus East, capitalist freedom versus communist totalitarianism. At least from where I'm sitting. Although now apparently I'm going to change where I'm sitting, because it's time for the mystery document. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, and about 55% of the time I get shocked by the shock pen. We must organize and enlist the energies and resources of the free world in a positive program for peace, which will frustrate the Kremlin design for world domination by creating a situation in the free world to which the Kremlin will be compelled to adjust. Without such a cooperative effort, led by the United States, we will have to make gradual withdrawals under pressure until we discover one day that we have sacrificed positions of vital interest. It is imperative that this trend be reversed by a much more rapid and concerted buildup of the actual strength of both the United States and the other nations of the free world. I mean, all I can say about it is that it sounds American and like it was written in like 1951, and it seems kind of like a policy paper or something really boring. So I mean, yeah, I'm just gonna have to take the shock. Ah! National Security Council report to NSC 68. Are you kidding me, Stan? Not 64 or 81, 68. This is ridiculous. I call injustice. Anyway, as the apparently wildly famous NSC 68 shows, the US government cast the Cold War as a rather epic struggle between freedom and tyranny, and that led to remarkable political consensus. Both Democrats and Republicans supported most aspects of Cold War policy, especially the military buildup part. Now, of course, there were some critics, like Walter Lippmann, who worried that casting foreign policy in such stark ideological terms would result in the U.S. getting on the wrong side of many conflicts, especially as former colonies sought to remove the bonds of empire and become independent nations. But yeah, no, nothing like that ever happened. Yeah, I mean, it's not like that happened in Iran or Nicaragua or Argentina or Brazil or Guatemala. Or, Stan, are you really going to make me list all of them? Fine. Or Haiti, or Paraguay, or the Philippines, or Chile, or Iraq, or Indonesia, or Zaire. I'm sorry, there are a lot of them, okay? But these interventions were viewed as necessary to prevent the spread of communism, which was genuinely terrifying to people, and it's important to understand that. Like, national security agencies pushed Hollywood to produce anti-communist movies like The Red Menace, which scared people, and the CIA funded magazines, news broadcasts, concerts, art exhibitions that gave examples of American freedom. It even Germans supported painters like Jackson Pollock and the Museum of Modern Art in New York because American Expressionism was the vanguard of artistic freedom and the exact opposite of Soviet socialist realism. I mean, have you seen Soviet paintings? Look at the hardy ankles on these socialist comrade peasants. Also, because the Soviets were atheists, at least in theory, Congress in 1954 added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance as a sign of America's resistance to communism. The Cold War also shaped domestic policy. Anti-communist sentiment, for instance, prevented Truman from extending the social policies of the New Deal. The program that he dubbed the Fair Deal would have increased the minimum wage, extended national health insurance, and increased public housing, Social Security, and aid to education. But the American Medical Association lobbied against Truman's plan for national health insurance by calling it socialized medicine, and Congress was in no mood to pay money for socialized anything. That problem goes away. But the government did make some domestic investments as a result of the Cold War. In the name of national security, the government spent money on education, research in science, technology like computers, and transportation infrastructure. In fact, we largely have the Cold War to thank for our marvelous interstate highway system, although part of the reason Congress approved it was to set up speedy evacuation routes in the event of nuclear war. And speaking of nuclear war, it's worth noting that a big part of the reason the Soviets were able to develop nuclear weapons so quickly was thanks to espionage, like for instance by physicist and spy Klaus Fuchs. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Fuchs worked on the Manhattan Project and leaked information to the Soviets and then later helped the Chinese to build their first bomb. Julius Rosenberg also gave atomic secrets to the Soviets and was eventually executed, as was his less clearly guilty wife, Ethel. And it's important to remember all that when thinking about the United States' obsessive fear that there were communists in our midst. This began in 1947 with Truman's loyalty review system, which required government employees to prove their patriotism when accused of disloyalty. How do you prove your loyalty? Rat out your co-workers as communists. No, seriously though, that program never found any communists. This all culminated, of course, with the Red Scare and the rise of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, an inveterate liar who became enormously powerful after announcing in February 1950 that he had a list of 205 communists who worked in the State Department. In fact, he had no such thing, and McCarthy never identified a single disloyal American, but the fear of communism continued. In 1951's Dennis versus United States, the Supreme Court upheld the notion that being a communist leader itself was a crime. In this climate of fear, any criticism of the government and its policies, or the US in general, was seen as disloyalty. There was only one question: when will I be blown up? And it encouraged loyalty because only the government could prevent the spread of communism and keep us from being blown up. We've talked a lot about different ways that Americans have imagined freedom this year, but this was a new definition of freedom. The government exists in part to keep us free from massive destruction. So the Cold War changed America profoundly. The US has remained a leader on the world stage and continued to build a large, powerful, and expensive national state, but it also changed the way we imagine what it means to be free and what it means to be safe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is created by all of these nice people, and it is possible because of you and your support through Subbable.com. Subbable is a crowdfunding website that allows you to support stuff you love on a monthly basis. Our Subbable subscribers make this show possible. Thanks to them. If you value Crash Course, please check out our Subbable. There are great perks there. And thanks to all of you for watching. As we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Wait. Stan, is that music copyrighted? All right. It's not. Whew. Let's save this $1,000. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War again. Really less about the Cold, more about the war. As usual, we're not going to focus so much on the generals and the tactics, but instead on why the wars were fought and what it all meant. And today we get to visit a part of the world that we haven't seen much on this series: Asia. Not my best work. So we're going to start today with the place where the Cold War really heated up, at least as far as America's concerned.
Mr. Green, it's Vietnam.
Close, me from the past, but like all your romantic endeavors, unsuccessful. The correct answer is, of course, Korea. Like me from the past, many Americans have forgotten about the Korean War, which lasted 3 years from 1950 to 1953 and is sometimes called the Forgotten War. But it was real. The Korean War was the first real, shooting war that Americans were involved in after World War II, and it was also the only time that American troops directly engaged with an honest-to-goodness communist power. I am referring not to North Korea, but to China, which became communist in 1949 and qualifies as a major world power because it was, and also is, huge. We love you, China. Just kidding, you're not watching, because of the Great Firewall. So the end of World War II left Korea split between a communist North led by Kim Il-Crazy Pants Sung and an anti-communist but hardly democratic South led by Syngman Rhee. The two were supposed to reunite, but that was impossible because they were constantly fighting that cost around 100,000 lives. The civil war between the two Koreas turned into a full-fledged international conflict in June of 1950 when Kim Il-sung invaded the South and the US responded. Truman thought that Kim's invasion was being pushed by the Soviets and that it was a challenge to the, quote, free world. Truman went to the United Nations and he got authorization, but he didn't go to Congress and never called the Korean War a war, insisting instead that American troops were leading a UN police action. But that was kind of a misleading statement. General Douglas MacArthur was in command of this tiny little police force at the start of the war because he was the highest-ranking general in the region. He was also really popular, at least with the press, although not so much with other generals or with the president. Under MacArthur, UN forces, which basically meant American and South Korean forces, pushed the North Koreans back past the 38th parallel where the two countries had been divided. And then Truman made a fateful decision. The United States would try to reunify Korea as a non-communist state. Which, if you've looked at a map recently, you'll notice went swimmingly. America's allies and the UN all agreed to this idea, so up north they went, all the way to the northern border with China at the Yalu River. At that point, Chinese forces, feeling that American forces were a smidge too close to China, counterattacked on November 1st, 1950, and by Christmas, the two sides were stalemated again at the 38th parallel, right where they started. The war dragged on for 2 more years, with the US pursuing a scorched earth policy and dropping more bombs on Korea than had been dropped in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. The two sides tried to negotiate a peace treaty, but the sticking point was the repatriation of North Korean and Chinese prisoners who didn't want to go back to their communist homelands. Meanwhile, at home, Americans were growing tired of fighting a war that they weren't winning, which helped to swing the election of 1952 for Dwight Eisenhower. Also, he was running against perennial presidential loser Adlai Stevenson, who was perceived as an egghead intellectual because his name was Adlai Stevenson. In addition to helping Ike get elected, the Korean War had a number of profound effects. First, and most importantly, it was expensive, both in terms of lives and money. In 3 years of fighting, 33,629 Americans were killed, 102,000 were wounded, and nearly 4 million Korean and Chinese people were killed, wounded, or missing. The majority of Korean casualties were civilians. The Korean War also further strengthened executive power in the United States. Truman went to war without a declaration, and Congress acquiesced. This doesn't mean that the war was initially unpopular. It wasn't. People wanted to see America do something about communism, and allowing Kim to take the South and possibly threaten Japan was unacceptable. However, the whole idea that you don't really need to declare war to go to war, while not new in America, sure has been important in the last 60 years. And the Korean War also strengthened the Cold War mentality. I mean, this was the height of the Red Scare. Also, the Korean War set the stage for America's longer, more destructive, and more well-known engagement in Asia, the Vietnam War. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I'm either right or I get shocked. All right, let's see what we got. The Declaration of the French Revolution, made in 1791, states, "All men are born free and with equal rights and must always remain free and have equal rights." Those are undeniable truths. Nevertheless, for more than 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the standard of liberty, equality, and fraternity, have violated our fatherland and oppressed our fellow citizens. They have acted contrary to the ideals of humanity and justice. In the field of politics, they have deprived our people of every democratic liberty. Well, Stan, that sounds like a Frenchman who really doesn't want to be French anymore. So it's somebody who's very disappointed by the way that France has been running their colonies. I'm gonna guess that it's North Vietnamese leader and crash course chalkboard person Ho Chi Minh! Wait, Stan says he needs his real name. It's Win Sing Kong, yes! So this document points out that, at least rhetorically, Ho Chi Minh was fighting for liberation from a colonial power as much as, if not more than, he was trying to establish a communist dictatorship in Vietnam. But because of the Cold War and its prevailing theories, the United States could only see Ho as a communist stooge, a tool of the Kremlin. And under the so-called domino theory, Vietnam was just another domino that had to be propped up or else the rest of Southeast Asia would fall to communism like a row of dominoes. Now, in retrospect, this was a fundamental misunderstanding, but it's important to understand that at the time, people felt that they didn't want the Soviet Union to expand the way that, say, Nazi Germany had. America's involvement in Vietnam, like most things Cold War, dates back to World War II, but it really picked up in the 1950s as we threw our support behind the French in their war to maintain their colonial empire. Wait, Stan, why would we fight with the French to maintain a colonial empire? Oh, right. Because we were blinded by our fear of communism. Now, Eisenhower wisely refused to send troops or use atomic weapons to help the French. Really good call. And the Geneva Accords were supposed to set up elections to reunite North and South, which had been divided after World War II, but then we didn't let that happen. Because sometimes democracies don't vote for our guy. Instead, the US began supporting the repressive, elitist regime of Ngo Dinh Diem as a bulwark against communism. Diem was a Catholic in a majority Buddhist country, and his support of landowners didn't win him any fans, but he was against communism, which was good enough for us. The first major involvement of American troops, then called advisors, began in the early 1960s. Technically, their role was to advise the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, also called ARVN. How did they not know this was doomed? Let's fight for ARVN against this guy. You are scary. Seriously. Anyway, pretty quickly this advising turned into shooting, and the first American advisors were killed in 1961 during John Kennedy's presidency. However, most Americans consider Vietnam to be Lyndon Johnson's war, and they aren't wrong. The major escalation of American troops started under Johnson, especially in 1965 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is one of the great incidents in all of American history. So in August 1964, North Korean patrol boats attacked U.S. warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. As a result, Johnson asked Congress to authorize the president to take, quote, all necessary measures to repel armed attack in Vietnam, which Congress dutifully did with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So why is this one of the great incidents in American history? Because the whole patrol boats attacking warships thing, that didn't happen. None of that stuff happened, except we did actually go to war. Now, in retrospect, this seems like a terrible idea, but it was very popular at the time because, to quote the historian James Patterson, preventing communism, after all, remained the guiding star of American policy. Wait a second, did I just say, to quote historian James Patterson, like the crime novelist? Oh, it's a different guy, apparently. That's a bummer. He doesn't write his own books because he's so busy with his secret career, being a historian. So the number of American troops began a steady increase, and so did the bombing. The frightfully named Operation Rolling Thunder began in the spring of 1965, and in March of that year, 2 Marine battalions arrived at Da Nang Air Base authorized to attack the enemy. No advising about it. But Johnson didn't actually tell the American public that our troops had this authorization, which was part of a widening credibility gap between what the government told Americans about the war and what was really happening. Let's go to the thought bubble. By 1968, there were about 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam, and the government was confidently saying that victory was just around the corner. But then in January, Vietnamese forces launched the Tet Offensive, and while it was eventually repelled, the fact that the North Vietnamese were able to mount such an offensive cast doubts on the claims that U.S. victory was imminent. The Vietnam War itself was particularly brutal, with much of the ground fighting taking place in jungles. Rather than large-scale offensives, troops were sent on search and destroy missions, and often it was difficult to tell enemy from civilian. Capturing territory wasn't meaningful, so commanders kept track of body counts, like if more enemy were killed than Americans, we were winning. In addition to jungle fighting, there was a lot of bombing, like more bombs were dropped on North and South Vietnam than both the Axis and Allied powers used in all of World War II. The US used chemical defoliants like Agent Orange to get rid of that pesky jungle, and also napalm, which was used to burn trees, homes, and people. Television coverage meant that Vietnam was the first war brought into American living rooms, and people were horrified by what they saw. They were especially shocked by the My Lai massacre, which took place in 1968, but was only reported a year later in 1969. These draftees were young and disproportionately from the lower classes because enrollment in college or grad school earned you a deferment. So unlike previous American wars, the burden of fighting did not fall evenly across socioeconomic class. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So as Americans at home became increasingly aware of what was going on in Vietnam, protests started. But it's important to remember that the majority of Americans were not out in the streets or on college campuses burning their draft cards. Right up through 1968 and maybe even 1970, most Americans supported the Vietnam War. During the 1968 presidential campaign, Richard Nixon promised that he had a secret plan to end the war and appealed to the silent majority of Americans who weren't on board with the anti-war movement. So the first part of Nixon's secret secret plan was Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops and leaving the fighting to the Vietnamese. The second part involved more bombing and actually escalating the war by sending American troops into Cambodia in order to cut off the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, named for this guy, a supply line that connected north to south. Not only did this not work, it also destabilized Cambodia and helped the Khmer Rouge to come to power. The Khmer Rouge represented the absolute worst that communism had to offer, forcing almost all Cambodians into communes and massacring 1/3 of the country's population. So, not a great secret plan. In the United States, by 1970, the anti-war protests had grown, and discontent within the armed forces was enormous. Vietnam veterans, including future almost President John Kerry, were participating in protests, and things got even worse in 1971 when the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, classified documents that showed that the government had been misleading the public about the war for years. Congress eventually responded by passing the War Powers Act in 1973, which was supposed to limit the president's ability to send troops overseas without their approval and prevent another Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Oh, how does that work out, Stan?
Not great.
Yeah, I'll say. After 5 years of negotiations, Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, were able to end America's involvement in Vietnam. In 1973, the Paris Peace Agreement made it possible for America to withdraw its troops. The war between North and South Vietnam, however, continued until 1975, when the North finally conquered the South and created a single communist Vietnam. The Vietnam War cost the United States more than $100 billion. 58,000 Americans died, as well as between 3 and 4 million Vietnamese people. And Vietnam was the first war in American history that we definitively lost. We lost it because we didn't understand the Vietnamese, and we didn't understand why they were fighting. To return to the historian James Patterson, the unyielding determination of the enemy wore down the American commitment, which proved to be far less resolute. America expected that its superior technology and wealth would eventually wear down the Vietnamese, and they'd just give up communism. But the Vietnamese weren't fighting for communism. They were fighting for Vietnam. This fundamental misunderstanding, combined with the government's dishonesty, changed Americans' relationship with their leaders. Before Vietnam, most Americans trusted their government, even when they knew it did horrible things. But after the war, and largely because of it, that trust was gone. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is made with the assistance of all of these nice people, and also through your support at Subbable. Subbable is a voluntary subscription service that allows you to support Crash Course at the monthly price of your choice, including $0. So if you enjoy and value Crash Course, I hope you'll consider supporting us through Subbable. If you can't afford to do so, that's fine. We're just glad that you're watching. You can click my face, or there's also a link in the video info. Thanks again for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to look at one of the most important periods of American social history, the 1950s. Why is it so important? Well, first, because it saw the advent of the greatest invention in human history. Television.
Mr. Green, I like TV. By the way, you're from the future. How does the X-Files end? Are there aliens or no aliens?
No spoilers, me from the past. You're gonna have to go to college and watch the X-Files get terrible just like I did. No, it's mostly important because of the Civil Rights Movement. We're gonna talk about some of the heroic figures like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but much of the real story is about the thousands of people you've never heard of who fought to make America more inclusive. But before we look at the various changes that the Civil Rights Movement was pushing for, we should spend a little time looking at the society that they were trying to change. The 1950s has been called a period of consensus, and I suppose it was, at least for the white males who wrote about it, and who all agreed that the 1950s were fantastic for white males. Consensus culture was caused first by the Cold War. People were hesitant to criticize the United States for fear of being branded a communist, and second, by affluence. Increasing prosperity meant that more people didn't have as much to be critical of. And this widespread affluence was something new in the United States. Between 1946 and 1960, Americans experienced a period of economic expansion that saw standards of living rise and gross national product more than double. And unlike many previous American economic expansions, much of the growing prosperity in the 50s was shared by ordinary working people who saw their wages rise. To quote our old friend Eric Foner, by 1960, an estimated 60% of Americans enjoyed what the government defined as a middle-class standard of living. And this meant that an increasing number of Americans had access to things like television and air conditioning and dishwashers and air travel. That doesn't really seem like a bonus. Anyway, despite the fact that they were being stuffed into tiny metal cylinders and hurtled through the air, most Americans were happy because they had, like, indoor plumbing and electricity. The 1950s was the era of suburbanization. The number of homes in the United States doubled during the decade, which had the pleasant side effect of creating lots of construction jobs. The classic example of suburbanization was Levittown in New York, where 10,000 almost identical homes were built and became home to 40,000 people almost overnight. And living further from the city meant that more Americans needed cars, which was good news for Detroit, where cars were being churned out with the expectation that Americans would replace them every 2 years. By 1960, 80% of Americans owned at least one car, and 14% had two or more. And car culture changed the way that Americans lived and shopped. I mean, it gave us shopping malls and drive-through restaurants and the backseat makeout session. I mean, high school me didn't get the backseat makeout session, but other people did. I did get the Burger King drive-thru, though. And lots of it. Our whole picture of the American standard of living, with its abundance of consumer goods and plentiful services, was established in the 1950s. And so for many people, this era was something of a golden age, especially when we look back on it today with nostalgia, but there were critics, even at the time. So when we say the 1950s were an era of consensus, one of the things we're saying is that there wasn't much room for debate about what it meant to be an American. Most people agreed on the American values: individualism, respect for private property, and belief in equal opportunity. The key problem was that we believed in equal opportunity but didn't actually provide it. But some people were concerned that the cookie-cutter vision of the good life and the celebration of the middle-class lifestyle was displacing other conceptions of citizenship. Like the sociologist C. Wright Mills described a combination of military, corporate, and political leaders as a power elite whose control over government and the economy was such as to make democracy an afterthought. In The Lonely Crowd, sociologist David Reisman criticized Americans for being conformist and lacking the rich inner life necessary to be truly independent. And John Kenneth Galbraith questioned an affluent society that would pay for new cars and new missiles, but not for new schools. And we can't mention the 1950s without discussing teenagers, since this was the decade that gave us rock and roll and rock stars like Bill Haley and the Comets, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and Elvis Presley and his hips. So you might have noticed something about all those critics of the 1950s that I just mentioned. They were all white dudes. Now, we're going to be talking about women in the 1950s and 1960s next week, because their liberation movement began a bit later. But what most people call the civil rights movement really did begin in the 50s. While the 1950s were something of a golden age for many blue and white collar workers, it was hardly a period of expanding opportunities for African Americans. Rigid segregation was the rule throughout the country, especially in housing, but also in jobs and in employment. In the South, public accommodations were segregated by law, while in the North, it was usually happening by custom or de facto segregation. To give just one example, the new suburban neighborhoods that sprang up in the 1950s were almost completely white, and this remained true for decades. According to Eric Foner, as late as the 1990s, nearly 90% of suburban whites lived in communities with non-white populations less than 1%. And it wasn't just housing. In the 1950s, half of black families lived in poverty. When they were able to get union jobs, black workers had less seniority than their white counterparts, so their employment was less stable. And their educational opportunities were severely limited by substandard segregated schools. Now, you might think the civil rights movement began with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, or else Brown versus Board of Education, but it really started during World War II, with efforts like those of A. Philip Randolph and the soldiers taking part in the Double V Crusade. But even before that, black Americans had been fighting for civil rights. It's just that in the 1950s, they started to win. So desegregating schools was a key goal of the civil rights movement, and it started in California in 1946. In the case of Mendez versus Westminster, the California Supreme Court ruled that Orange County, of all places, had to desegregate their schools. They'd been discriminating against Latinos. And then California's governor, Earl Warren, signed an order that repealed all school segregation in the state. That same Earl Warren, by the way, was Chief Justice when the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education came before the Supreme Court in 1954. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, had been pursuing a legal strategy of trying to make states live up to the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson that required all public facilities to be separate but equal. They started by bringing lawsuits against professional schools, like law schools, because it was really obvious that the 3 classrooms and no library that Texas set up for its African-American law students were not equal to the actual University of Texas's law school. But the Brown case was about public schools for children. It was actually a combination of 5 cases from 4 states, of which Brown happened to be alphabetically the first. The Board of Education in question, incidentally, was in Topeka, Kansas, not one of the states of the old Confederacy, but nonetheless a city that did restrict its schooling by race. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document. If I'm wrong, I get shocked. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Stan, the last 2 weeks you have given me two extraordinary gifts, and I am thankful. It is Earl Warren from Brown versus Board of Education. Huzzah! Justice Warren is actually quoting from sociological research there that shows that segregation itself is psychologically damaging to black children because they recognize that being separated out is a badge of inferiority. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The Brown decision was a watershed, but it didn't lead to massive, immediate desegregation of the nation's public schools. In fact, it spawned what came to be known as massive resistance in the South. The resistance got so massive, in fact, that a number of counties, rather than integrate their schools, closed them. Prince Edward County in Virginia, for instance, closed its schools in 1959 and didn't reopen them again until 1964. Except they didn't really close them because many states appropriated funds to pay for white students to attend, quote, private academies. Some states got so into the resistance that they began to fly the Confederate battle flag over their state capitol buildings. Yes, I'm looking at you, Alabama and South Carolina. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and got arrested, kicking off the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted almost a year. A lot of people think that Rosa Parks was simply an average African-American working woman who was tired and fed up with segregation, but the truth is more complicated. Parks had been active in politics since the 1930s and had protested the notorious Scottsboro Boys case. She'd served as secretary for the NAACP, and she had begun her quest to register to vote in Alabama in 1943. She failed a literacy test 3 times before becoming one of the very few black people registered to vote in the state. And in 1954, she attended a training session for political activists and met other civil rights radicals. So Rosa Parks was an active participant in the fight for black civil rights long before she sat on that bus. The bus boycott also thrust into prominence a young pastor from Atlanta, the 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. He helped to organize the boycott from his Baptist church, which reminds us that black churches played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. That boycott would go on to last for 381 days, and in the end, the city of Montgomery relented. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So that was, of course, only the beginning for Martin Luther King, who achieved his greatest triumphs in the 1960s. After Montgomery, he was instrumental in forming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a coalition of black civil rights and church leaders who pushed for integration, and they needed to fight hard, especially in the face of massive resistance and an Eisenhower administration that was lukewarm at best about civil rights. But I suppose Eisenhower did stick up for civil rights when forced to, as when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus used the National Guard to prevent the integration of Little Rock Central High School by 9 black students in 1957. Eisenhower was like, you know, as the guy who invaded Normandy, I don't think that's the best use for the National Guard. So Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division, not the entirety of it, but some of it, to Little Rock, Arkansas to walk kids to school, which they did for a year. After that, Faubus closed the schools, but at least the federal government showed that it wouldn't allow states to ignore court orders about the Constitution. In your face, John C. Calhoun! Despite the court decision and the dispatching of federal troops, by the end of the 1950s, fewer than 2% of black students attended integrated schools in the South. So the modern movement for civil rights had begun, but it was clear that there was still a lot of work to do. But the emergence of the civil rights movement shows us that the picture of consensus in the 1950s is not quite as clear-cut as its proponents would have us believe. Yes, there was widespread affluence, particularly among white people, and criticism of the government and America generally was stifled by the fear of appearing to sympathize with communism. But there was also widespread systemic inequality and poverty in the decade that shows just how far away we were from living the ideal of equal opportunity. That we have made real progress, and we have, is a credit to the voices of protest. Next week, we'll see how women, Latinos, and gay people added their voices to the protests and look at what they were and were not able to change in the 1960s. Thanks for watching. I'll see you then. Crash Course is made with the help of all of these nice people, and it's possible because of your support through Subbable.com. Subbable is a voluntary subscription service that allows you to subscribe to Crash Course at the price of your choosing, including $0 a month. But hopefully more than that. There are also great perks that you can get, like signed posters, so if you like and value Crash Course, help us keep it free for everyone forever by subscribing now at Subbable. You can just click on my face. Now my face moved, but you can still click on it. Thanks again for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the 1960s.
Mr. Green, great. The decade made famous by the narcissists who lived through it.
Hey, me from the past. Finally, you and I agree about something wholeheartedly. But while I don't wish to indulge the baby boomers' fantasies about their centrality to world history, the 60s were an important time. I mean, there was the Cold War, Vietnam, a rising tide of conservatism despite Woodstock, racism. There were the Kennedys and Camelot, John, Paul, George, and to a lesser extent Ringo. And of course, there was also Martin Luther King Jr. So the 1960s saw people organizing and actively working for change both in the social order and in government. This included the student movement, the women's movement, movements for gay rights, and a push by the courts to expand rights in general. But by the end of the 1960s, the anti-war movement seemed to have overshadowed all the rest. So as you'll no doubt remember from last week, the civil rights movement began in the 1950s, if not before, but many of its key moments happened in the 60s. And this really began with sit-ins that took place in Greensboro, North Carolina. Black university students walked into Woolworths and waited at the lunch counters to be served, or more likely, arrested. After 5 months of that, those students eventually got Woolworths to serve black customers. Then in 1961, leaders from the Congress on Racial Equality launched freedom rides to integrate interstate buses. Volunteers rode the buses into the Deep South, where they faced violence, including beatings and a bombing in Anniston, Alabama. But despite that, those freedom rides also proved successful, and eventually the ICC desegregated interstate buses. In fact, by the end of the 60s, over 70,000 people had taken part in demonstrations, from sit-ins to teach-ins to marches. But they weren't all successful. Martin Luther King's year-long protests in Albany, Georgia didn't end discrimination in the city, and it took JFK ordering federal troops to escort James Meredith to class for him to attend the University of Mississippi. The University of Mississippi, America's fallback college. Sorry, I'm from Alabama. So the civil rights movement reached its greatest national prominence in 1963 when Martin Luther King came to my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama, where there had been more than 50 racially motivated bombings since World War II. Television brought the reality of the Jim Crow South into people's homes as images of Bull Connor's police dogs and water cannons being turned on peaceful marchers, many of them children, horrified viewers, and eventually led Kennedy to endorse the movement's goals. Probably should mention that John F. Kennedy was president of the United States at the time, having been elected in 1960. He was assassinated in 1963, leading to Lyndon Johnson. All right, politics over. Anyway, in response to these peaceful protests, Birmingham jailed Martin Luther King, where he wrote one of the great letters in American history. Doesn't have a great name. Letter from Birmingham Jail. 1963 also saw the March on Washington, the largest public demonstration in American history up to that time, where King gave his famous speech, "I have a dream." King and the other organizers called for a civil rights bill and help for the poor, demanding public works, a higher minimum wage, and an end to discrimination in employment. Which eventually, in one of the great bright spots in American history, did sort of happen with the Civil Rights Act. So one reason American history teachers focus on the civil rights movement so much is that it successfully brought actual legislative change. After being elected president, John F. Kennedy was initially cool to civil rights, but to be fair, the Cold War occupied a lot of his time, what with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs and whatnot. But the demonstrations of 1963 pushed John F. Kennedy to support civil rights more actively. According to our dear friend, the historian Eric Foner, Kennedy realized that the United States simply could not declare itself the champion of freedom throughout the world while maintaining a system of racial inequality at home. So that June, he appeared on TV and called on Congress to pass a law that would ban discrimination in all public accommodations. And then he was assassinated. Thanks, Lee Harvey Oswald. Or possibly someone else, but probably Lee Harvey Oswald. So then Lyndon Johnson became president, and he pushed Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The law prohibited discrimination in employment, schools, hospitals, and privately owned public places like restaurants and hotels and theaters, and it also banned discrimination on the basis of sex. The Civil Rights Act was a major moment in American legislative history, but it hardly made the United States a haven of equality. So civil rights leaders continued to push for the enfranchisement of African Americans. After Freedom Summer Workers registered people in Mississippi to vote, King launched a March for Voting Rights in Selma, Alabama in January 1965. And again, television swayed public opinion in favor of the demonstrators. Thank you, TV, for your one and only gift to humanity. Just kidding, Battlestar Galactica. So in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which gave the federal government the power to oversee voting in places where discrimination was practiced. In 1965, Congress also passed the Hart-Celler Act, which got rid of national origin quotas and allowed Asian immigrants to immigrate to the United States. Unfortunately, the law also introduced quotas on immigrants from the Western Hemisphere. Lyndon Johnson's domestic initiatives from 1965 through 1967 are known as the Great Society, and it's possible that if he hadn't been responsible for America escalating the war in Vietnam, he might have been remembered, at least by liberals, as one of America's greatest presidents. Because the Great Society expanded a lot of the promises of the New Deal, especially in the creation of health insurance programs like Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor. He also went to war on poverty. Never go to war with a noun. You will always lose. Johnson treated poverty as a social problem rather than an economic one, so instead of focusing on jobs or guaranteed income, his initiatives stressed things like training. That, unfortunately, failed to take into account shifts in the economy away from high-wage union manufacturing jobs toward more lower-wage service jobs. Here's what Eric Foner had to say about Johnson's domestic accomplishments. By the 1990s, the historic gap between whites and blacks in education, income, and access to skilled employment narrowed considerably. But with deindustrialization and urban decay affecting numerous families and most suburbs still being off limits to non-white people, the median wealth of white households remained 10 times greater than that of African Americans, and nearly a quarter of all black children lived in poverty. While Congress was busy enacting Johnson's Great Society programs, the movement for African American freedom was changing. Let's go to the thought bubble. Persistent poverty and continued discrimination in the workplace, housing, education, and criminal justice system might explain the shift away from integration and toward Black Power, a celebration of African American culture and criticism of whites' oppression. 1964 saw the beginnings of riots in city ghettos, for instance, mostly in northern cities. The worst riots were in 1965 in Watts, in Southern California. These left 35 people dead, 900 injured, and $30 million in damage. Newark and Detroit also saw devastating riots in 1967. In 1968, the Kerner Report blamed the cause of the rioting on segregation, poverty, and white racism. Then there's Malcolm X, who many white people regarded as an advocate for violence, but who also called for self-reliance. It's tempting to see leadership shifting from King to X as the civil rights movement became more militant, but Malcolm X was active in the early 1960s, and he was killed in 1965, 3 years before Martin Luther King was assassinated and before all the major shifts in emphasis toward Black Power. Older civil rights groups like CORE abandoned integration as a goal after 1965 and started to call for Black Power. The rhetoric of Black Power could be strident, but its message of Black empowerment was deeply resonant for many. Oakland's Black Panther Party did carry guns in self-defense, but they also offered a lot of neighborhood services. But the Black Power movement turned many white people away from the struggle for African American freedom, and by the end of the 1960s, many Americans' attention had shifted to the anti-war movement. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So it was Vietnam that really galvanized students, even though many didn't have to go to Vietnam because they had student deferments. They just really didn't want their friends to go. The anti-war movement and the civil rights movement inspired other groups to seek an end to oppression, like Latinos organized to celebrate their heritage and end discrimination. Latino activism was like Black Power, but much more explicitly linked to labor justice, especially the strike efforts led by Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. The American Indian movement, founded in 1968, took over Alcatraz to symbolize the land that had been taken from Native Americans, and they won greater tribal control over education, economic development, and they also filed suits for restitution. And in June of 1969, after police raided a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn, members of the gay community began a series of demonstrations in New York City which touched off the modern gay liberation movement. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are pretty simple. I read the mystery document, guess the author, I'm either right or I get shocked. All right, what do we got here? If the Bill of Rights contains no guarantee that a citizen shall be secure against lethal poisons distributed either by private individuals or by public officials, I already know it. It is surely only because of our forefathers, despite their considerable wisdom and foresight, could conceive of no such problem. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring.
Yes, I am on such a roll!
Silent Spring was a massively important book because it was the first time that anyone really described all of the astonishingly poisonous things we were putting into the air and the ground and the water. Fortunately, that's all been straightened out now, and everything that we do and make as human beings is now sustainable. What's that? Oh God. The environmental movement gained huge bipartisan support, and it resulted in important legislation during the Nixon era, including the Clean Air and Water Acts and the Endangered Species Act. And yes, I said that environmental legislation was passed during the Nixon administration. But perhaps the most significant freedom movement in terms of number of people involved and long-lasting effects was the American feminist movement. This is usually said to have begun with the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which set out to describe, quote, the problem that has no name. Turns out the name is misogyny. Friedan described a constricting social and economic system that affected mostly middle-class women, but it resonated with the educated classes and led to the foundation of the National Organization of Women in 1966. Participation in student and civil rights movement led many women to identify themselves as members of a group that was systemically discriminated against. And by systemic, I mean that in 1963, 5.8% of doctors were women and 3.7% of lawyers were women, and fewer than 10% of doctoral degrees went to women. They are more than half of the population. While Congress responded with the Equal Pay Act in 1963, younger women sought greater power and autonomy in addition to legislation. Crucially, 60s-era feminists opened America to the idea that the personal is political, especially when it came to equal pay, childcare, and abortion. Weirdly, the branch of government that provided most support to the expansion of personal freedom in the 1960s was the most conservative one, the Supreme Court. The Warren Court handed down so many decisions expanding civil rights that the era has sometimes been called a rights revolution. The Warren Court expanded the protections of free speech and assembly under the First Amendment and freedom of the press in the New York Times versus Sullivan decision. It struck down a law banning interracial marriage in the most appropriately named case ever, Loving versus Virginia. And although this would become a lightning rod for many conservatives, Supreme Court decisions greatly expanded the protections of people accused of crimes. Gideon versus Wainwright secured the right to an attorney. Mapp versus Ohio established the exclusionary rule under the Fourth Amendment, and Miranda versus Arizona provided fodder for Channing Tatum in his great movie 21 Jump Street, ensuring that he would always have to say to every perp, "You have the right to remain silent. But you can't silence my heart, Channing Tatum. It beats only for thee." But the most innovative and controversial decisions actually established a new right where none had existed in the Constitution. Griswold versus Connecticut dealt with contraception, and Roe v. Wade guaranteed a woman's right to an abortion at least in the first trimester, and those two decisions formed the basis of a new right: the right to privacy. Protests, the counterculture, and the liberation movements continued well into the 1970s, losing steam with the end of the Vietnam War and America's economy plunging into the toilet. For many, though, the year 1968 sums up the decade. 1968 began with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which stirred up the anti-war protests. Then, racial violence erupted after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968. Then, anti-war demonstrators, as well as some counterculture types, arrived in large numbers at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where they were set upon by police and beaten in what was later described as a police riot. 1968 also saw the Prague Spring Uprising in Czechoslovakia crushed by the Soviets, and student demonstrators were killed by the police in Mexico City, where the Olympics were held, and Parisian students took to the streets in widespread protests against, France. All this unrest scared a lot of people, who ended up voting for Richard Nixon and his promises to return to law and order. Ultimately, like any decade or arbitrary historical age, the 60s defies easy categorization. Yes, there were hippies and liberation movements, but there were also reactions to those movements. On this one, I'm just going to leave it up to Eric Foner to summarize the decade's legacy. The 1960s made possible the entrance of numerous members of racial minorities into the mainstream of American life, while leaving unsolved the problem of urban poverty. It set in motion a transformation of the status of women. It changed what Americans expected from their government, from clean air and water to medical coverage in old age, and at the same time it undermined confidence in national leaders. Relations between young and old, men and women, and white and non-white, along with every institution in society, changed as a result. But there's one last thing I want to emphasize. All of this wasn't really the result of a radical revolution. It was the result of a process that had been going on for decades. Arguably a process that had been going on for hundreds of years. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
Crash Course is made with the help of all of these nice people, and it's possible because of generous support from the Bluth Family Frozen Banana Stand. Just kidding, we don't have corporate sponsors. We have you. Subbable.com is a voluntary subscription platform, by the way, you can just click on my face, that allows people who care about stuff, like you hopefully care about Crash Course, to support it directly on a monthly basis. I'm over here now, but you should still click on my face. So Subbable has lots of great Crash Course perks. You can get signed posters and all kinds of things, and most importantly, you can help us keep this show free forever for everyone. Thank you again for watching, and as we say in my hometown, there's always money in the banana stand.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about one of the most important periods in American history, the mid to late 1970s. Stan, why is there nothing on the chalkboard? We can't find a picture of Gerald Ford somewhere around here? Don't worry, Crash Course fans, we got one. Thanks for your support through Subbable. It paid for this 90-cent Gerald Ford photograph. These really are the years when everything changed in the United States, and amidst all that turmoil, something wonderful was born.
Mr. Green! Strong with the Force this episode is.
No, me from the past. Yoda doesn't show up till Empire Strikes Back, which came out in 1980. I'm referring, of course, to the fact that we were born. It's the beginning of the John Green era. From here on out, almost everything we discuss will have happened in my lifetime, or as most Crash Course viewers refer to it, that century before I was born. But it wasn't just the birth of me and the death of Elvis. The late 1970s were truly a period of momentous change, and for most Americans, it sucked. So how Americans reacted to those no good, very bad years really has shaped the world in which we find ourselves. The big story of the 1970s is economics. 25 years of broad economic expansion and prosperity came to a grinding halt in the 1970s, meaning that our party was over. And what did we get instead? Inflation and extremely slow growth. The worst hangover ever. Just kidding, the worst hangover was the Depression. The second worst hangover was the 2008 recession, and then the third worst hangover was Hangover Part 3. It was the fourth worst hangover in American history, narrowly beating out America's fifth worst hangover, the Hangover Part 2. What happened to the American economy in the 1970s was the result both of long-term processes and unexpected shocks. The long-term process was the gradual decline of manufacturing in the US in relation to competing manufacturing in the rest of the world. Part of this was due to American policy. After World War II, you'll remember that we promoted the economic growth of Japan, Germany, South Korea, and Taiwan, ignoring tariffs that they set up to protect nascent industries and effectively subsidizing them by providing for their defense. And not having to build nuclear arsenals of their own really allowed them to invest in their domestic economies. And then one day, a bunch of Toyotas and Mercedes showed up, and you could drive them up to like 40,000 miles before they would break down, and we were like, wait a second! In 1971, for the first time in the 20th century, America experienced an export trade deficit, importing more goods than it exported, which is the same problem that my aunt has with QVC. I mean, they hardly import anything from her. One reason for this deficit was because the dollar was linked to gold, making it a strong currency, but also making American products more expensive abroad. So Nixon took the US off the gold standard, hoping to make American goods cheaper overseas and reduce imports. But that didn't really work, because the US was also competing against cheaper labor costs and cheaper raw materials and more productive economies. And in many cases, this growing global competition put American firms that couldn't compete out of business. This was especially true in manufacturing. In 1960, 38% of Americans worked in manufacturing. In 1980, it was 28%. Today, it's 9. Not 9%, 9 people. Stan wants me to tell you that that was a joke. It actually is 9%. Unionized workers were hit particularly hard. In the 1940s and 1950s, unions had won generous concessions from corporate employers, including paid vacation and health benefits, and especially pensions, which employers would agree to as a kind of deferred compensation, so they wouldn't have to pay higher wages to people while they were working. And this worked great until people started to retire. So by 1970, competition led employers to either eliminate high-paying manufacturing jobs, or else to increase automation, or to shift workers to lower wage regions of the US, or even overseas. Meanwhile, the northern industrial cities, particularly the Rust Belt of the Midwest, were becoming the empty urban playgrounds that we know and love today. Detroit and Chicago had lost half of their manufacturing jobs by 1980, and smaller cities fared even worse. As industry moved away, they found their tax bases dried up, and they were unable to provide even basic services to their citizens. I mean, with the world of Wall Street fat cats, this is hard to imagine today, but in 1975, New York City faced bankruptcy. In addition to these long-term structural changes to the American economy and our demographics, the 1970s saw two oil shocks that sent the economy into a tailspin. In 1973, in response to Western support of Israel, Middle Eastern Arab states suspended oil exports to the U.S., which led to the price of oil quadrupling. This resulted in long lines for gasoline, dramatically higher oil prices, and Americans deciding to purchase smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, which is to say Japanese cars. Also, prices of everything else went up because oil is either used for the production of or transportation of just about everything. I mean, with 70s inflation, this 90-cent portrait of Gerald Ford would have cost at least $1.10. The paint that covers the green parts of Not America? Oil-based. The plastic that comprises the DVDs of Crash Course World History, available now at dftba.com, oil-based. Those are a fantastic bargain, and they would have been way more expensive if the price of oil was higher. And then, in 1979, a second oil shock hit the United States after the Iranian Revolution. Wait, Stan, did we say 1979? We gotta put up a picture of Jimmy Carter. Bam! Sorry, Gerald Ford, there's a peanut farmer in town. So during the 1970s, inflation soared to 10% a year, and economic growth slowed to 2.4%, resulting in what came to be known as stagflation. Unemployment rose and a new economic statistic was born, the misery index, the combination of unemployment and inflation. At the beginning of the decade, it was 10.8. By 1980, it had doubled. If you're looking for the roots of America's contemporary economic inequality, the 1970s are a good milestone, since according to our old friend Eric Foner, beginning in 1973, real wages essentially did not rise for 20 years. Americans got to experience the joy of 2 years of Jerry Ford before poor Jimmy Carter had a chance to fail at improving the economy. The only president never to have been elected even to the vice presidency, Gerald Ford was so insignificant in American history that we already replaced him on the chalkboard. One of Ford's first acts was to pardon Nixon, making him immune from prosecution for obstruction of justice. That very unpopular decision probably made it impossible for Ford to win in 1976. Coincidentally, WIN was the only memorable domestic program that Ford proposed. It stood for Whip Inflation Now, and it was basically a plea for Americans to be better shoppers, spend less, and wear WIN buttons. 35 years later, Charlie Sheen would turn winning into an incredibly successful social media campaign, but sadly at the time there was no Twitter. Inflation did drop, but unemployment went up, especially during the recession of 1974 and 1975, where it topped 9%. Now, Ford would have liked to cut taxes and reduce government regulation, but the Democratic Congress wouldn't let him. So that's Ford, probably best known today as the first president to be satirized on Saturday Night Live. Then, in 1976, we got a new president, Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter is generally considered by historians to have been a failure as president, although he's often seen as a really good ex-president. He tried to fight the inflation part of stagflation, and to do it, he acted in some rather un-New Deal Democrat ways. He cut government spending, deregulated the trucking and airline industries, and he supported the Fed's decision to raise interest rates. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document, I guess the author. If I'm wrong, I get shocked. All right, let's see what we got today. I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. I do not mean our political and civil liberties. They will endure. And I do not refer to the outward strength of America, a nation that is at peace tonight everywhere in the world, with unmatched economic power and military might. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and political fabric of America. It's Jimmy Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech, my favorite speech ever made that also cost the president 20 points of approval rating. So Carter says that Americans have lost their ability to face the future and some of their can-do spirit. The rest of the speech talks about how Americans' values are out of whack, how Americans are wasteful and need a more vibrant approach to the energy crisis. Let me tell you a lesson from history, Jimmy Carter. You don't get reelected by telling Americans how to do more with less. You get reelected by telling Americans more, always
always more for you, more, I promise.
The speech ultimately called for a renewal of spirit, but all people remember is the part where Jimmy Carter was criticizing them, and it's gone down as a great example of Carter's political ineptitude. Domestically, Carter paid lip service to liberal ideas like energy conservation, even installing solar panels on the White House, but his bigger plan to solve the energy crises was investment in nuclear power. And nuclear power did grow, although never to the extent we saw in certain European countries, partly because of the accident at 3 Mile Island in 1979 when radioactive vapor was released into the air. This, of course, spurred public fears of a nuclear meltdown and drove a huge anti-nuclear energy movement. Now, in many ways, Carter was more important as a foreign policy president, but as with his energy initiatives, he's mostly remembered for his failures. Aiming to make human rights a cornerstone of America's foreign policy, Jimmy Carter tried to turn away from the Cold War framework and focus instead on combating third world poverty and reducing the spread of nuclear weapons. Let's go to the thought bubble. Carter's notable changes included cutting off aid to Argentina during its dirty war and signing a treaty in 1978 that would transfer the Panama Canal back to Panama. His greatest accomplishment was probably brokering the Camp David Accords. This historic peace agreement between Egypt and Israel has, as we all know, led to a lasting peace in the Middle East. Just kidding, but it has been a step in the right direction and one that's lasted. But the U.S. continued to support dictatorial regimes in Guatemala, the Philippines, and South Korea. Carter's most significant failure in terms of supporting international bad guys, though, is the Shah of Iran. Iran had oil and was a major buyer of American arms, but the Shah was really unpopular, and our support of him fueled anti-American sentiments in Iran. Those boiled over in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, especially after Carter allowed the Shah to get cancer treatments in America, which in turn prompted the storming of the American embassy in Tehran and the capture of 53 American hostages. The Iranian hostage crisis lasted 444 days, and although Carter's Secretary of State did negotiate their release, it didn't happen until the day Carter's successor, Ronald Reagan, was inaugurated. The inability to free the hostages and the botched rescue attempt, Affleck's Argo notwithstanding, added to the impression that Carter was weak. Events in the Middle East also increased Cold War tensions, especially after 1979, when the USSR invaded Afghanistan. Carter claimed that the invasion of Afghanistan was the greatest threat to freedom since World War II and proclaimed the Carter Doctrine, which basically said that the U.S. would use force, if necessary, to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf region. In direct response to the Soviets, the U.S. put an embargo on grain shipments and organized the boycott of the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. Thanks for another dose of good news, Thought Bubble. So despite focusing on Carter, I'll again stress that the real story of the 1970s was the economy. High inflation and high unemployment had monumental effects in shaping America, and no president could have dealt with it effectively. Not Carter, not Gerald Ford, not anyone. The truth is, history isn't about individuals. Oil shocks and inevitable systemic changes led to the poor economy, and that weakened support for New Deal liberalism and increased the appeal of conservative ideas like lower taxes, reduced regulations, and cuts in social spending. All of which, for the record, started under the Democrat Jimmy Carter, not the Republican Ronald Reagan. More abstractly, the economic crisis of the 1970s dealt a serious blow to the Keynesian consensus that government action could actually solve macroeconomic problems. I mean, according to the economic theory that had prevailed for the previous 50 years, unemployment and inflation were supposed to be inversely proportional, the so-called Phillips curve. When that relationship broke down and we had both high inflation and high unemployment, it undermined the entire idea of government intervention. And that opened the door for a different way of thinking about economics that emphasized the economy as an aggregate of individual economic decisions. Now that might sound like a small thing, but whether you think individual choices or governmental policies really make economies work or not work turns out to be pretty freaking important. And this has really come to shape the contemporary American political landscape, especially when it comes to taxes, which we'll talk more about next week. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is made with the help of all of these nice people, and it exists because of your support through Subbable, and also because so many of you are buying Crash Course World History on DVD. Thank you! Our mission here at Crash Course is to make educational content freely available to everyone forever, and you can help us in that mission, if you're able, by subscribing at Subbable. Subbable is a voluntary subscription platform where you can get amazing perks like signed posters and lots of other stuff, so check it out. Thank you for supporting Crash Course, thanks for watching, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome!
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War, which actually lasted into my lifetime, which means that I can bore you with stories from my past like your grandpa does. When I was a kid, they made us practice hiding under our desks in the event of a nuclear attack because, you know, school desks are super good at repelling radiation. Mr. Green, right, remember in elementary school there was this special guest who defected from the Soviet Union and he had like this crazy Russian accent and he kept going on about how Reagan should spit in Gorbachev's face instead of signing treaties with him? And I was like, whoa, dude, calm down. You're in a room full of third graders. And then for months afterward on the playground, we'd play Reagan Gorbachev and spit in each other's faces. Those were the days. Sometimes I forget that you're me from the past. Yeah, it's just really nice to talk to you and feel like you're listening. You're boring. Cue the intro. So the Cold War was a rivalry between the USSR and the USA that played out globally. We've tried to shy away from calling conflicts ideological or civilizational here on Crash Course, but in this case, the clash of civilizations model really does apply. Socialism, at least as Marx constructed it, wanted to take over the world, and many Soviets saw themselves in a conflict with bourgeois capitalism itself. And the Soviets saw American rebuilding efforts in Europe and Japan as the US trying to expand its markets, which, by the way, is exactly what we were doing. So the US feared that the USSR wanted to destroy democratic and capitalist institutions, and the Soviets feared that the US wanted to use its money and power to dominate Europe and eventually destroy the Soviet system. And both parties were right to be worried. It's not paranoia if they really are out to get you. Now, of course, we've seen a lot of geopolitical struggles between major world powers here on Crash Course, but this time there was the special added bonus that war could lead to the destruction of the human species. That was new for world history, and it's worth remembering it's still new. Here's the period of time we've discussed on Crash Course, and this is how long we've had the technological capability to exterminate ourselves. So that's worrisome. Immediately after World War II, the Soviets created a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, dominating the countries where the Red Army had pushed back the Nazis. Which is why Winston Churchill famously said in 1946 that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. While the dates of the Cold War are usually given between 1945 and 1990, a number of historians will tell you that it actually started during World War II. Stalin's distrust of the US and Britain kept growing as they refused to invade Europe and open up a second front against the Nazis. And some even say that the decision to drop the first atomic bombs on Japan was motivated in part by a desire to intimidate the Soviets. That sort of worked, but only insofar as it motivated the Soviets to develop atomic bombs of their own. They successfully tested their first one in 1949. From the beginning, the US had the advantage because it had more money and power and could provide Europe protection, what with its army and one-of-a-kind nuclear arsenal, while Europe rebuilt. The USSR had to rebuild itself, and also they had the significant disadvantage of being controlled by noted asshat Joseph Stalin. I will remind you, it's not cursing if he's wearing an ass for a hat. Oh, I guess it's time for the open letter. An open letter to Joseph Stalin. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's Silly Putty. Silly Putty, the thing that won the Cold War. This is exactly the kind of useless consumer good that would never have been produced in the Soviet Union. And it is because we had so much more consumer spending on stuff like Silly Putty that we won the Cold War. Go team! Dear Joseph Stalin, you really sucked. There was a great moment in your life at your first wife's funeral when you said, "I don't think I shall ever love again." And then later, you had that wife's whole family killed. Putting aside the fact that you're responsible for tens of millions of deaths, I don't like you because of the way you treated your son Yakov. I mean, you were really mean to him, and then he shot himself, and he didn't die, and you said, he can't even shoot straight. And then later, when he was captured during World War II, you had a chance to exchange prisoners for him, but you declined. And then he died in a prison camp. You were a terrible leader, a terrible person, and a terrible father. Best wishes, John Green. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. Europe was the first battleground of the Cold War, especially Germany, which was divided into two parts, with the former capital, Berlin, also divided into two parts. And yes, I know the western part was divided into smaller occupation zones, but I'm simplifying. In 1948, the Soviets tried to cut off West Berlin by closing the main road that led into the city, but the Berlin airlift stopped them. And then in 1961, the Soviets tried again, and this time they were much more successful, building a wall around West Berlin, although it's worth noting that the thing was up for less than 30 years. I mean, Meatloaf's career has lasted longer than the Berlin Wall did. The US response to the Soviets was a policy called containment. It basically involved stopping the spread of communism by standing up to the Soviets wherever they seemed to want to expand.
In Europe, this meant spending a lot of money. First, the Marshall Plan spent $13 billion on rebuilding Western Europe with grants and credits that Europeans would spend on American consumer goods and on construction. Capitalism's cheap food and plentiful stuff, it was hoped, would stop the spread of communism. The US also tried to slow the spread of communism by founding NATO and with CIA interventions in elections where communists had a chance, as in Italy. But despite all the great spy novels and shaken, not stirred martinis, the Cold War never did heat up in Europe. Probably the most important part of the Cold War that people just don't remember these days is the nuclear arms race. Both sides developed nuclear arsenals, the Soviets initially with the help of spies who stole American secrets. Eventually, the nuclear arsenals were so big that the US and USSR agreed on a strategy appropriately called MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And yes, nuclear weapons were and are capable of destroying humanity many times over. But only once or twice did we get close to nuclear war, during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and then again in 1983 when we forgot to give the Russians the heads up that we were doing some war games which made it look like we had launched a first strike. Our bad! But even though mutually assured destruction prevented direct conflict, there was plenty of hot war in the Cold War. The Korean War saw lots of fighting between communists and capitalists, as did the Vietnam War. I mean, these days we remember the domino effect as silly paranoia, but after Korea and especially China became communist, Vietnam's movement toward communism seemed very much a threat to Japan, which the US had helped remake into a vibrant capitalist ally. So the US got bogged down in one of its longest wars while the Soviets assisted the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong, but then we paid them back by supporting the anti-communist Mujahideen after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Of course, as we now know, nobody conquers Afghanistan, unless you are the Mongols. So after 10 disastrous years, the Soviets finally abandoned Afghanistan. Some of those Mujahideen later became members of the Taliban, though, so it's difficult to say that anyone won that war. But it wasn't just Asia. In Nicaragua, the US supported rebels to overthrow the leftist government. In El Salvador, the US bolstered authoritarian regimes that were threatened by left-wing guerrillas. The United States ended up supporting a lot of awful governments, like the one in Guatemala, which held on to power through the use of death squads. Frankly, all our attempts to stabilize governments in Latin America led to some very unstable Latin American governments and quite a lot of violence. And then there were the lukewarm conflicts, like the Suez Canal crisis, where British and French paratroopers were sent in to try to stop Egypt from nationalizing the Suez Canal, or all the American covert operations to keep various countries from falling to communism. These included the famous CIA-engineered coup to overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after his government attempted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, and the CIA helping Chile's General Augusto Pinochet overthrow democratically elected Marxist President Salvador Allende in 1973. And lest we think the Americans were the only bad guys in this, the Soviets used force to crush popular uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So you may have noticed that our discussion of the Cold War has branched out from Europe to include Asia and the Middle East and Latin America, and in fact almost every part of the globe was involved in some way, with the planet being divided into 3 worlds. The first world was the US, Western Europe, and any place that embraced capitalism and a more or less democratic form of government. The second world was the Soviet Union and its satellites, mostly the Warsaw Pact nations China and Cuba. The third world was everyone else, and we don't use this term anymore because it lumps together a hugely diverse range of countries. We'll talk more about the specific economic and development challenges faced by the so-called third world countries, but the big one in terms of the Cold War was that neither the US nor the Soviets wanted any of these countries to remain neutral. Every nation was supposed to pick sides, either capitalist or communist, and while it seems like an easy choice now, in the 50s and 60s it wasn't nearly so clear. I mean, for a little while it seemed like the Soviets might come out ahead, at least in the third world. For a while, capitalism, and especially the United States, seemed to lose some of its luster. The US propped up dictatorships, had a poor civil rights record, we sucked at women's gymnastics, plus the Soviets were the first to put a satellite, a man, and a dog into space. Plus Marxists just seemed cooler, which is why you never see Milton Friedman t-shirts. Until now, available at dftba.com. I like that, Stan, but I'm more of a centrist. Can I get a Keynes shirt? Yes! Now that's hot. But Soviet socialism did not finally prove to be a viable alternative to industrial capitalism. Over time, state-run economies just generally don't fare as well as private enterprise, and people like living in a world where they can have more stuff. More importantly, Soviet policies were just bad. Collectivized agriculture stymied production and led to famine, suppression of dissent and traditional cultures made people angry, and no one liked suffering the humiliation of driving a Yugo. But why the Cold War ended when it did is one of the most interesting questions of the 20th century.
history. It probably wasn't Ronald Reagan bankrupting the Soviets, despite what some politicians believe. The USSR had more satellite states that it needed to spend more to prop up than the US had to invest in its allies, and the Soviet system could never keep up with economic growth in the West. But probably the individual most responsible for the end of the Cold War was Mikhail Baryshnikov. No? Mikhail Gorbachev? Well, that's boring. I always thought the Soviets danced their way to freedom, no? It was glasnost and perestroika? All right. Right, but Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost opened up the Soviet political and economic systems with contested local elections, less restricted civil society groups, less censorship, more autonomy for the Soviet republics, more non-state-run businesses, and more autonomy for state-run farms. Glasnost, or openness, led to more information from the West, and less censorship led to a flood of criticism as people realized how much poorer the Second World was than the First. And one by one, often quite suddenly, former communist states collapsed. In Germany, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and East and West Germany were reunited in 1990. In Poland, the Gdansk Dockworkers Union Solidarity turned into a mass political movement and won 99 of the 100 seats it was allowed to contest in the 1989 election. Hungary held multi-party elections in 1990. The same year, mass demonstrations led to elections in Czechoslovakia. In 1993, that country split up into Slovakia and the Czech Republic, the happiest and most mutually beneficial divorce since Cher left Sunny. Of course, sometimes the transition away from communism was violent and painful. In Romania, for instance, the communist dictator Ceausescu held on to power until he was tried and put before a firing squad at the end of 1989, and it took until 1996 for a non-communist government to take power there. And in Yugoslavia, well, not so great. And in Russia, it's a little bit Putin-y. Yeah, Putin! But just 20 years later, it's hard to believe that the world was once dominated by two superpowers held in check by mutually assured destruction. What's really amazing to me, though, is that until the late 1980s, it felt like the Cold War was going to go on forever. Time seems to slow as it approaches us, and living in the post-Cold War nuclear age, we should remember that the past feels distant, even when it's near, and that the future seems assured, even though it isn't. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher Raoul Meyer and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. Last week's phrase of the week was Justin Bieber. Thanks for that suggestion. If you'd like to suggest future phrases of the week, you can do so in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
Hiya, Dr. Kutz.
Hello, David. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I am excited to learn about this thing we call the Cold War. What is a Cold War and what makes it different than a hot war?
So a Cold War, and in this case, it's really, it might be a term that we could debate, is a war where the two major combatants never actually fire bullets at each other or drop bombs on each other. So never in the course of the Cold War did the U.S. ever meet ground troops with the USSR.
But people still died in combat.
Right.
Okay.
So the Cold War is kind of fought through proxy wars. And these are wars that are taking place in other nations, developing nations of the world, where the U.S. is supporting one side, generally the pro-capitalist side, and the Soviet Union is supporting the other side, a communist side. So this is the case in the Korean War in the 1950s, and then definitely the case in the Vietnam War in the 1960s.
So the U.S. and the USSR aren't fighting directly, but they're kind of betting on boxing matches, betting on different fighters in the same boxing match.
Yeah, but they're not just betting. They're also putting money and arms where their mouth is.
Okay.
So, if there are two different fighters in the ring, the U.S. is given the capitalist fighter, is feeding him.
So you've got the capitalist fighter in one corner, and, he's sweaty and he's beaten, but the U.S. is behind him with, like, a towel and one of those, like, a water bucket splashing water in his face, like, get in there, Sparky, get in there.
Right, and if necessary, tying up his boxing glove, maybe
Sure.
giving him a new pair of shoes.
Sure.
And, doing whatever they can.
Paying his rent.
Right. Doing everything that they can.
Buying him meals, probably, right? That's the
Yes,
Marshall Plan.
Exactly.
Okay, so tell me about these two combatants in this corner, wearing a suit.
Is Harry Truman. And Harry Truman is the President of the United States starting in 1945 He was vice president to Franklin Roosevelt, who had been the U.S.'s president since 1932, and who tragically died in 1945. So Truman is really in charge of ending World War II for the United States and also kind of setting a post-war plan.
So he prosecutes the end of the war. He makes the decision to drop the atom bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and he ends the war in both theaters.
Right.
Okay.
And
in the other corner, wearing a very fine mustache,
is Joseph Stalin, and he's the Soviet premier. He's been in charge since the 1920s. And for him, I would say the most important thing that Stalin wanted after World War II was security, shall we say. So if you remember your history, in World War I, Germany invaded Russia. In World War II, Germany invaded Russia.
Oh, I'm seeing a pattern.
And if there's anything that Stalin wants in the post-1945 era, it is not to be invaded by Germany anymore.
Sure.
So he is very anxious to make sure that the world is safe for communism. He thinks that the best way to make sure that Russians can continue the experiment and the revolution of communism is to have a buffer zone, shall we say, between Russia and the rest of Europe.
Okay.
And he does that by kind of shoring up some puppet governments in what we now call the Eastern Bloc. These nations that had been taken over by Hitler, and then when the Soviet Union joined the war on the side of the Allies, then were retaken over by Russia as they fought Hitler back.
So a lot of those Central European countries like Hungary and Lithuania and the former Czechoslovakia,
Right.
former Yugoslavia.
And he has the advantage of having boots on the ground there,
Okay.
right? Because he'd beaten back Hitler's invasion. Eventually, right, Russian troops who are fighting against Hitler and American troops who are fighting against Hitler, they meet in Berlin at the fall of Hitler and kind of shake hands in Berlin. But the advantage that Russia has is they've got a lot more people here. They've got, most of Europe now, at least east of Berlin, has Soviet troops on the ground.
Sure. So, Kim,
Yeah.
you had been telling me that the Soviet Union did yeoman's work in containing and basically prosecuting the entire Eastern Front during World War II.
Yeah, and the Soviet Union actually lost 20 million people
God.
during World War II. That's, just a ludicrous number. They lost more than anyone except for China and Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like they have a real stake in the outcome of World War II.
So at the end of this, what is the situation in the USSR? Like, they've conquered all of this territory, but are they strong enough economically to hold all of it and feed everyone?
No, not really. In fact, most of Europe is in pretty dire straits. If you think about it, all of World War II was really kind of fought, right, in Europe.
Right in the European breadbasket.
And so there is serious economic trouble in the aftermath of World War II. People don't have enough to eat.
Mm-hmm.
They certainly don't have any cash. And they don't have any fuel, which is very worrisome in 1946 because that's a terrible winter.
Mm-hmm.
So people are cold and they are hungry. And when people are cold and hungry, there is a lot of fuel for a possible revolution.
Sure.
Right? Even in the 1930s, right, in the United States, there's a lot of different political ideas that come up during the Great Depression because when your political system isn't working well, you consider other kinds of political systems.
So the United States is worried that because of the cold winter of 1946 and scarcity across Western Europe, this blue part of the map is going to turn much redder.
Right. So for the United States, they're worried that communism is kind of the child of hunger and poverty.
Okay.
And they're afraid that because Stalin has so much territory in Europe, that he is really well poised to become Hitler Part 2.
Okay. And that is a sequel the United States does not want to see.
No, absolutely not. And if they really learned anything from World War II, it's that appeasement doesn't work.
Okay.
Right? During the 1930s, many people in the West, the Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain, kind of felt like they didn't want to go back to war, right? Because World War I is still very much on people's minds in the 1930s. And so they figured, let's not confront Hitler head on, because, we're not up for that right now. We're also in the middle of a worldwide depression. And that helped nothing, because it just meant that Hitler could gain a whole lot of territory, and World War II was much worse than it might have been if they hadn't gone after Hitler earlier.
And stopped the Anschluss.
Yes.
If you stop the Anschluss, you stop the onslaught.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they're really trying to say, all right, Stalin, if he wants to, could probably just run his way through the rest of Europe, right, with very little resistance.
Okay.
Because the only nation in the world that has the military and economic power to stop the Soviet Union is the United States.
Because their factories and fields were not bombed to cinders during the European theater.
Right. So if they want to stop Hitler Part 2, the Stalin years, right, then they're going to have to really stand up for capitalism and also for the kind of material comforts and democratic, what we'd call self-determination, right? This is one of the most important ideas to come out of the alliance between the United States and Britain, which is that the citizens of a region should have the right to decide their own form of government.
Okay.
And they think of the Soviets as being totalitarians, and that's not a wrong assessment, because there is a very strong totalitarian control coming out of Moscow and the Soviet Union. So they say, if we're going to keep Europe from turning all red, all communist, then we're going to need to kind of shore up Europe.
Okay.
They think of communism as kind of being a little bit like a flood, should we say, that you gotta put sandbags around the edges of communism. Otherwise, it's going to leak out.
So is the United States and their allies also interested in creating their own kind of light blue buffer zone, also next to the Eastern Bloc? Or are they interested in... Is this when we get into the creation of NATO?
NATO really comes out of an understanding that World War II has not created peace.
Okay.
And so the U.S. is going to have to forego their, more than a century-long commitment to being isolationist and take a stronger role in the world.
So for the folks at home, what does NATO stand for? North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is it's a defensive alliance between, at first, 12 nations, which say that an attack on one will be treated as an attack on all.
Gotcha. Well, that sounds like they're maneuvering their boxers into position and like rubbing the shoulders and getting them ready.
Yes, very much so. And I think one of the tragedies of the post-war era is that maybe things didn't have to be like this, right? After the U.S. and the USSR had worked together to defeat Hitler, it might have been possible for them to coexist peacefully. But I think they both had the idea that the other economic system, and we're talking about communism and capitalism, was just kind of riddled with internal inconsistencies, and that eventually the world would be all capitalist or all communist. And they were going to have to really marshal all of their resources behind their chosen boxer, or they were going to lose.
Sounds like a fight that's going to take a long time.
And it did.
End round one.
thought I would do a video on communism just because I've been talking about it a bunch in the history videos, and I haven't given you a good definition of what it means or a good understanding of what it means. And to understand communism, let me just draw a spectrum here. So I'm going to start with capitalism. And this is really just going to be an overview. People can do a whole PhD thesis on this type of thing. Capitalism, and then I'll get a little bit more, and then we could progress to socialism. And then we can go to communism. And the modern versions of communism are really kind of the brainchild of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Karl Marx was a German philosopher in the 1800s who, in his Communist Manifesto and other writings, kind of created the philosophical underpinnings for communism. And Vladimir Lenin, who led the Bolshevik Revolution in and created essentially the Soviet Union, he's the first person to make some of Karl Marx's ideas more concrete. And really every nation or every country which we view as communist has really followed the pattern of Vladimir Lenin. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's talk about the philosophical differences between these things and how you would move. And Karl Marx himself viewed communism as kind of a progression from capitalism through socialism to communism. So what he saw in capitalism, and this, at least this part of what he saw was right, is that you have private property, private ownership of land. That's the main aspect of capitalism, and this is the world that most of us live in today. The problem that he saw with capitalism is he thought, well, look, when you have private property, the people who start accumulating some capital, and when we talk about capital, we could be talking about land, we could be talking about factories, we could be talking about any type of natural resources. So the people who start getting a little bit of them, so let me draw a little diagram here. So let's say someone has a little bit of capital, and that capital could be a factory or it could be land. So let me write it capital. And let's just say it's land. So let's say someone starts to own a little bit of land, and he owns more than everyone else. So then you just have a bunch of other people who don't own land, but they need to essentially, and since this guy owns all the land, they got to work on this guy's land. They have to work on this guy's land. And from Karl Marx's point of view, he said, look, you have all of these laborers who don't have as much capital. This guy has this capital, and so he can make these laborers work for a very small wage. And so any excess profits that come out from this arrangement, the owner of the capital will be able to get it, because these laborers won't be able to get their wages to go up because there's so much competition for them to work on this guy's farm or to work on this guy's land. He really didn't think too much about, well, maybe the competition could go the other way. Maybe you could have a reality eventually where you have a bunch of people with reasonable amounts of capital, and you have a bunch of laborers, and the bunch of people would compete for the laborers, and maybe the laborers could make their wages go up, and they could eventually accumulate their own capital. They could eventually start their own small businesses. So he really didn't think about this reality too much over here. He just saw this reality. And to his defense, and I don't want to get in the habit of defending Karl Marx too much, to his defense, this is what was happening in the late 1800s. Especially, we have the Industrial Revolution. Even in the United States, you did have kind of, Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age. You have these industrialists who did accumulate huge amounts of capital. They really did have a lot of the leverage relative to the laborers. And so what Karl Marx says, well, look, if the guy with all the capital has all the leverage and this whole arrangement makes some profits, he's going to be able to keep the profits because he can keep all of these dudes' wages low. And so what's going to happen is that the guy with the capital is just going to end up with more capital. He's going to end up with more capital, and he's going to have even more leverage, and he'll be able to keep these people on kind of a basic wage so that they can never acquire capital for themselves. So in Karl Marx's point of view, the natural progression would be for these people to start organizing. So these people maybe start organizing into unions, so they could collectively tell the person who owns the land or the factory, no, we're not going to work, or we're going to go on strike unless you increase our wages, or unless you give us better working conditions. So when you start talking about this unionization stuff, you're starting to move in the direction of socialism. The other element of moving in the direction of socialism is that Karl Marx didn't like this kind of high concentration, and this is socialists in general, I should say, didn't like this high concentration of wealth. That you have this reality of not only do you have these people who could accumulate all of these wealth, and maybe to some degree they were able to accumulate it because they were innovative or they were good managers of land or whatever. Although the Marxists don't give a lot of credit to the owners of capital. Not they don't really give a lot of credit to saying maybe they did have some skill in managing some type of an operation. But the other problem is that it gets handed over. It gets handed over to their offspring. So private property, you have the situation where it just goes from maybe father to son or from parent to a child. And so it's not even based on any type of meritocracy. It's really just based on this inherited wealth. And this is a problem that definitely happened in Europe when you go back to the French Revolution. You have generation after generation of nobility, regardless of how incompetent each generation would be. They just had so much wealth that they were essentially in control of everything, and you had a bunch of people with no wealth having to work for them. And when you have that type of wealth disparity, it does lead to kind of revolutions. So another principle of moving in the socialist direction is kind of a redistribution of wealth. So let me write it over here. So redistribution. So in socialism, you can still have private property, but the government takes a bigger role. So you have, let me write this, larger government. And one of the roles of the government is to redistribute wealth. And the government also starts having control of kind of the major factors of production. So maybe the utilities, maybe some of the large factories that do major things, all of a sudden starts to become in the hands of the government, or in the words of communists, in the hands of the people. And the redistribution is going on. So in theory, you don't have huge amounts of wealth in the hands of a few people. And then if you kind of take these ideas to their natural conclusion, you get to the theoretical communist state. And the theoretical communist state is a classless, and maybe even a little bit a classless society. And in Karl Marx's point of view, and this is a little harder to imagine, a stateless society. So in capitalism, you definitely had classes. You had the kind of the class that owns the capital, and then you had the labor class, and you have all of these divisions, and they're different from each other. He didn't really imagine a world that maybe a laborer could get out of this. They could get their own capital. Maybe they could start their own business. So he just saw this tension would eventually lead to socialism, and eventually a classless society where you have a central. Well, he didn't even go too much into the details, but you have kind of equal. Everyone in society has ownership over everything, and society somehow figures out where things should be allocated and all of the rest. And it's all stateless. So and that's even harder to think about in a concrete fashion. So that's Karl Marx's view of things, but it never really became concrete until Vladimir Lenin shows up. And so the current version of communism that the current thing that most of us view as communism is sometimes viewed as a Marxist-Leninist state. Leninist. These are sometimes used interchangeably. Marxism is kind of the pure utopian. We're eventually going to get to a world where everyone is equal. Everyone is, doing exactly what they want. There's an abundance of everything. I guess to some degree, it's kind of describing what happens in Star Trek, where everyone can go to a replicator and get what they want. And if you want to paint part of the day, you can paint part of the day. And you're not just a painter. You can also do whatever you want. So it's this very utopian thing. Let me write that down. So Marxism, pure Marxism, is kind of a utopian society. And just in case you don't know what utopian means, it's kind of a perfect society where you don't have classes, everyone is equal, everyone is leading these kind of rich, diverse, fulfilling lives. And it's also, utopian is also kind of viewed as unrealistic. It's kind of, if you view it in the more negative light, is like, hey, I don't know how we'll ever be able to get there. Who knows? I don't want to be negative about it. Maybe we will one day get to a utopian society. But Leninist is kind of the more practical element of communism, because obviously after the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, in the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union gets created, they had to actually run a government. They had to actually run a state based on these ideas of communism. And in a Leninist philosophy, and this is where it starts to become in tension with the ideas of democracy, in a Leninist philosophy, you need this kind of a party system. So you need this, and he calls this the vanguard party. So, the vanguard is kind of the thing that's leading, the one that's leading the march. So this vanguard party that kind of creates this constant state of revolution, and its whole job is to guide society, is to kind of almost be the parent of society and take it from capitalism through socialism to this ideal state of communism. And it's one of those things where the ideal state of communism was never, it's kind of hard to know when you get there. And so what happens in a Leninist state is this vanguard party, which is usually called the Communist Party, is in a constant state of revolution, kind of saying, hey, we're shepherding the people to some future state without a real clear definition of what that future state is. And so when you talk about Marxist-Leninists, besides talking about what's happening in the economic sphere, it's also kind of talking about this party system, but this party system where you really just have one dominant party that it will hopefully act in the interest of the people. So one dominant communist party that acts in the interest of the people. And obviously, the negative here is that, how do you know that they actually are acting in the interest of people? How do you know that they actually are competent? What means are there to do anything if they are misallocating things? If it is corrupt? If you only have a one-party system? And just to make it clear, so the largest existing communist state is the People's Republic of China. And although it is, it's controlled by the Communist Party, in economic terms, it's really not that communist anymore. And so it can be confusing. And so what I want to do is draw a little bit of a spectrum. On the vertical axis, over here, I want to put democratic. And up here, I'll put authoritarian or totalitarian. Let me put I'll put authoritarian. I'll do another video on the difference. Authoritarian. And they're similar. And totalitarian is more an extreme form of authoritarian, where the government controls everything, and you have a few people controlling everything. It's very non-democratic. But authoritarian is kind of along those directions. And then in this spectrum, we have the capitalism, socialism, and communism. So the United States, I would put the United States someplace over here. I would put the United States over here. It has some small elements of socialism. You do have labor unions. They don't control everything. You also have people who are working outside of labor unions. It does have some elements of redistribution. There are inheritance taxes. It's not an extreme form of redistribution. You can still inherit private property. You still have kind of safety nets for people. You have Medicare, Medicaid. You have welfare. So there's some elements of socialism, but it also has a very strong capitalist history, private property, deep market. So I'd stick the United States over there. I would put the USSR, not current Russia, but the Soviet Union when it existed. I would put the Soviet Union right about there. So this was the I would put the USSR right over there. I would put the current state of Russia, actually. I would put the current state of Russia someplace over here, because they actually have fewer safety nets, and they kind of have their economy can kind of go crazier, and they actually have a bigger disparity in wealth than a place like the United States. So this is current Russia. And probably the most interesting one here is the People's Republic of China, the current People's Republic of China, which is, at least on the surface, a communist state. But in some ways, it's more capitalist than the United States in that they don't have strong wealth redistribution. They don't have kind of strong safety nets for people. So you could put some elements of China and over here, closer to the left, and they are less democratic than either the U.S. or even current Russia, although some people would call current Russia, well, I won't go too much into it, but current China, you could throw it here a little bit, so it could be even a little bit more capitalist than the United States. Definitely, they don't even have good labor laws, all the rest, but in other ways, you do have state ownership of a lot, and you do have state control of a lot. So in some ways, they're kind of spanning this whole range. So this right over here is China. And even though it is called a communist state, in some ways it's more capitalist than what countries that are very proud of their capitalism. But in a lot of other ways, especially with the government ownership and the government control of things and this one dominant party, so it's kind of Leninist with less of the Marxist going on. So in that way, it is more in the communist direction. So hopefully that clarifies what can sometimes be a confusing topic. Before we go into the actual conflict of the Korean War, let's try to get a sense of the historical environment going into the Korean War. So if you go all the way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Korean Peninsula, what we now consider both North and South Korea, they were occupied by the Japanese military. And then in 1910, the Korean Peninsula is formally annexed into the Japanese Empire. So the Japanese are essentially this colonial, this imperialist power here, and they stay in power in the Korean Peninsula all the way until the end of World War II. And it's probably worth saying here, and it's probably worth doing a bunch of videos here, that the Japanese occupation was not a pleasant occupation for the Korean people. They subjugated the Korean people in multiple ways: forced labor, forced prostitution. They tried to kind of eradicate the Korean language and the Korean culture. So this was not in any way a pleasant occupation. They weren't pleasant imperialists. But you fast forward all the way to 1945, we know that Japan loses World War II. And the major two victors on the Allied side that are kind of acting in this part of the world are the United States and the Soviet Union. And so 1945, you have the Soviets coming from above. You have the Soviets coming from above. That's the Soviets coming from above. And eventually you have the Americans coming from below. They occupy Japan first, so this is the USA. And they essentially, remember at this point, even though this is kind of the beginning of the Cold War, at this point in World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union are allies. And so the United States kind of tells the Soviet Union, hey, why don't we just stop at the 38th parallel? Why don't we just stop at the 38th parallel? And the United States actually didn't even think that the Soviets would stop there, but they actually did. And from the Soviets' point of view, it's believed that they stopped there because the United States didn't get there at the same time. So there was no one to stop them from going further south. But it's believed that the Soviets wanted to uphold their side of the agreement so that they could get, so that they would be a trusted party to negotiations in Europe and maybe get more in Europe, which is what the Soviets maybe cared about more. So what happens after World War II is that the North, what's now North Korea essentially, becomes under the influence of the Soviets. Everything below the 38th parallel becomes under the influence of the United States. The Soviets essentially install this gentleman right over here to lead North Korea, Kim Il-sung, or the part of Korea that is north of the 38th parallel. At this point, this was just kind of viewed as a point where the Soviets and the United States should kind of meet up, where they would have to stop. It wasn't meant to be an actual partition of the country, but as we'll see, it actually becomes a partition of the country. But the Soviets install Kim Il-sung. He sets up a communist, essentially a communist dictatorship in the north, and this is the current leader of North Korea's dad. This is Kim Jong-il's dad. So he gets installed in the north, and in the South, if you fast forward a little bit to 1948, there's an attempt at elections, but those elections are seriously rigged. And this gentleman, Syngman Rhee, comes to power. And although he might look like a nice, pleasant man, he was actually fairly ruthless, and he is, unanimously considered a strong man. And on both sides of this, so once again, this is one of those situations where you really can't call either of these guys good guys, because both of them have done some pretty nasty things to each other, to soldiers on either side, and to innocent civilians. But Syngman Rhee comes to power in the South, and his, I guess, most attractive feature to the Americans is that he is not a communist. And so you have this situation setting up: communist North above 38th parallel, non-communist South controlled by Syngman Rhee, supported by the United States. The other thing that happens is that the Soviets help build up the North Korean military. The United States is not as encouraging of a strong South Korean military. So you start having an imbalance between the military of the North and the South. And obviously, either one of these parties, Kim Il-sung wants to unite Korea under his rule, under his communist rule. Syngman Rhee wants to unite Korea under his authoritarian rule. So they're both kind of setting up troops. They're both setting up troops along the border. And this whole time, this whole time you have skirmishes going on across the border. And just to give you a context, you're probably saying, wait, Korea's right next to China. What was going on there? And if you go to China, you in 1949, the communists come to power. There was a civil war leading up to that between the communists led by Mao Zedong and the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. Mao Zedong comes to power. He wants to support the communists in North Korea, especially because some of those communists in North Korea actually helped fight on the communist side during the Chinese Civil War. So this is an important factor right here. Mao Zedong is interested in spreading communism. He doesn't like the Americans in South Korea, and he feels some type of allegiance to the communists in North Korea. So now you fast forward to June 25th, 1950. And in the north, you have a major, there's a lot, the North Korean army, and it's not called North Korea at this point. They both consider themselves Korea, competing, I guess, governments of Korea. The army in the north is disproportionately stronger than the south, and so they invade. They view this as their chance at unifying the peninsula. And essentially, they're able to almost just kind of storm through the Korean peninsula. Immediately when that happens, the UN, and especially the United States, and this is because at this point the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council, so they couldn't even veto it. The UN immediately starts supplying naval and air support for the South Koreans. But the disparity is so big that the North Koreans are able to just keep marching forward. Within a few days, literally by July 1st, the United States decides to commit ground forces, because we had substantial ground forces in Japan, which isn't that far away. Just to give you a global perspective, this is the Korean peninsula right here, and this is Japan. I know I could have probably found a bigger picture of that, but America had military forces in Japan that they could send, and so the Americans enter the battle in a major way very early on. But that doesn't stop the North Koreans for some time. So the North Koreans get all the way, they're able to occupy all of the Korean peninsula except for kind of the northeastern corner. So they get around this far. And so over here you have the city of Pusan, and this is called the Pusan Perimeter. Pusan Perimeter. And it's at the Pusan Perimeter that you have a little bit of the United States and Korean forces combined are able to halt the North Koreans. And you have a kind of a slight stalemate for a couple of months here. But while that stalemate is happening, the United States is able to, and especially the UN, but it's mainly the United States, is able to build up significant troops within the Pusan Perimeter. But even more, and at this point, the United States and the UN forces go under the control of Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, who's a bit of an interesting character. Until this point, he was able to kind of rule Japan with an iron fist. He's a hugely popular war hero in America. And the current president, Truman, kind of has a little trouble controlling MacArthur, especially during the Korean War. And we'll see that MacArthur really oversteps his bounds during the course of this war. Now at this point, you have the South Koreans and the Americans kind of cornered out down here inside of the Pusan Perimeter. It looks like North Korea is on the verge of victory, but the U.S. is able to build forces. And the Korean War really just starts becoming into a game of Risk. I don't know if you've ever played the game of Risk, but whenever it's somebody's turn, they're able to spread their forces, but then they get spread thin, and then the other side's able to come back. And we'll see as the rest of the Korean War is essentially a back and forth between the communists in the north, supported by the Chinese, although the Chinese aren't in the war officially just yet, and then the Americans in the south. And the first really smart thing that MacArthur does is he says, look, instead of trying to fight our way through the Korean forces that are over here, instead of trying to fight our way through all of these Korean forces that are over here, why don't we just kind of outflank them? And why don't we use our Navy to do an amphibious landing of an army at Incheon? So in September 15th, while you have kind of the stalemate over here, the United States, they have an amphibious landing. So they send troops from all of these places. They have an amphibious landing at Incheon, which is near Seoul. So they land at Incheon, which is roughly over there. I'm not super accurate here. And what's interesting about that is, in any battle, all of these Korean troops right here, they have supply chains. They have to get food and supplies and fresh troops from up here. And so the further in you go into enemy territory, the more spread out your troops get. And the strategies here is, instead of fighting through this, what if we outflank them and are able to land a significant force right here and immediately disrupt the supply lines of the North Koreans? And that's essentially what the Americans did, and it was successful. So MacArthur looks like a genius over here, and he's able to retake Seoul. He's able to take what's kind of the North Korean capital at this point, Pyongyang, and you have the Americans marching north. So all of a sudden, it started off with the North Koreans being able to roll down, and now all of a sudden the Americans and the South Koreans are able to roll up, and they're feeling pretty good about themselves. And the whole time, Truman's trying to keep MacArthur under check. MacArthur's excited. He's ultra confident. He thinks that the troops are going to be home by Christmas. He doesn't think China is serious about supporting the North Koreans, and even more, he almost, it seems like, wants to pick a fight with China because he wants to maybe eliminate communism in China as well. He viewed it as, he's kind of on this mission to eliminate communism from all of Asia. So Truman is saying limited war. Don't cross the Yalu River, and be careful. Don't start attacking Chinese up here and enrage them, and you're going to have them enter the war. MacArthur it doesn't take that too seriously. And he also says, look, I have to start bombing bombs across the Yalu River so that the Chinese won't be able to send troops and supplies to aid the North Koreans. So he's marching up all confident, going up against the Yalu River. And this whole time, the Chinese under Mao Zedong, are sending a pretty substantial army, and they're able to do it secretly. They're able to march at night, and they even have these policies where if any surveillance planes go overhead, all of the Chinese soldiers have to freeze, and if they don't freeze, someone else is allowed to shoot them. So everyone wants to freeze so that no one can really see them from above. So it's this really kind of a secret buildup of troops across the Yalu River, and this whole time MacArthur is just ultra confident about what's happening over here. But then you fast forward until the end of October, the Americans think that they're on the verge of winning the Korean War, and all of a sudden you have the Chinese cross the Yalu River, and the Americans didn't even know that the Chinese had major forces ready to cross. So now you have and once again, it's just like a game of risk. So now you have the Chinese cross. They catch the Americans unsuspected. They engage a few times. The Americans weren't sure if the Chinese were serious, so they keep re-engaging them. But then it becomes clear, yes, the Chinese are serious. The Chinese are serious, and essentially the Chinese are able to push back the Americans and the South Koreans all the way back so that they're able to recapture Seoul. But once again, like any game of risk, now the Chinese are spread thin. The Americans and the South Koreans and all the other UN forces, although the UN forces are mainly the Americans, are able to regroup. And then in March, so Seoul has changed hands 4 times. So in March, they're able to retake Seoul again. And at this point, MacArthur, ultra confident, he's telling the Chinese, you've essentially lost. He's even trying to get permissions to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese. To some degree, he doesn't even think he needs the permission of Truman to stop. It sounds like he's eager to push the Chinese further back, even though they kind of surprised him the first go around. So Truman has enough of this wild card guy who thinks that he can call the shots and use nuclear weapons if he wants to willy-nilly. And so Truman finally dismisses MacArthur in April of 1951. And at this point, you start having a stalemate. You start having a stalemate near the 38th parallel, so that you start having a stalemate across this border right over there. And both sides think the end of the war is imminent. They're like, okay, we're back to where we both began. We should both stop here. But the negotiations, unfortunately, took over 2 years, and there's a lot of, I guess, back and forth about what to do with prisoners of war and all of the rest. But it finally took 2 years, so that in July 27th, 1953, you have an armistice signed between the two parties. And I want to make it clear, an armistice agreement, it is not a peace treaty. It is not saying that we both agree that this is the border of our 2 new countries and that we are now at peace with each other. All an armistice means is that we're going to stop fighting. It is not a formal end to the war. So in theory, North and South Korea, even to this day, are in a state of war. And to this day, I'm recording this video in 2011. Maybe if you view this in the future, hopefully they won't be in an official state of war. But they're in an official state of war under an armistice. They've just agreed to stop fighting. So all in all, you have this hugely bloody battle with all of these atrocities going on both sides. Syngman Rhee, when he was the first time when the North Korean troops were rolling into South Korea, he essentially beforehand he was kind of imprisoning a bunch of people who he suspected to be communists. And when I'm talking about people, I'm talking about whole families sometimes. And when he was retreating, he essentially allowed the massacre of a huge number of people who were just suspected of being communists. And these weren't just military men; these were women, these were children, these were entire families. So he's guilty of that. And Kim Il Sung just as guilty when the North Korean soldiers infiltrated the South Korea and Seoul. They committed atrocities, killing civil servants, killing any of the kind of established intellectuals in the area. So on both sides, this hugely horrific war. And just to get a sense of what was happening, Korea isn't a huge country, but you have within Korea the civilian deaths, 1.5 to 3 million civilian deaths, and the consensus is at 2 million. And this tells you how ugly war is, that you can't even estimate how many people died to the nearest 500,000 people. You just don't know what happened. But 2 million people died in a country that's not too big. You have 30, all in all, you have about 40,000 American soldiers dying. China loses on the order of, depending on the estimates, 400,000 soldiers. I mean, the estimates are all over the place. North Korea loses on the order same magnitude of soldiers. South Korea loses, several hundred thousands of soldiers. So you have this hugely bloody battle, this hugely bloody war, I should say, that really ends with an outcome that wasn't so different from where it started. Before jumping into the details of the Bay of Pigs invasion, I want to make sure we understand the environment in Cuba and the United States leading up to the invasion. So, going into the late 1950s, Cuba was controlled by this guy right over here, Batista. And he was a dictator that was supported by the United States. And just to give a sense of what he was like, here's a quote from John F. Kennedy in 1963. So this is after he's already had the Bay of Pigs has happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis has happened. He is not a big fan of Fidel Castro. But with that said, in hindsight, JFK did say this, and this is, I think, a pretty objective assessment of what Batista was like as the dictator of Cuba. This is John F. Kennedy saying this. I believe there's no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. So even John F. Kennedy, in hindsight, is saying that Batista really was really not the best person, and it really was not a good idea for the United States to support such a corrupt dictator for so long in Cuba. And this is Batista right over here riding with some U.S. generals in a parade when he visited D.C. So you can imagine he was not a popular person in control of Cuba. And in 1959, you have a successful revolution against him. 1959, there is a revolution. And the revolution is led by this character, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, and his kind of number two, his right hand men are Raúl Castro and Che Guevara, right over here. And they take control of Cuba. They're part of this nationalist revolutionary movement. Now, the one thing they do, and they are left-leaning from the beginning. People assume that they are maybe communist or quasi-communist. But even from the get-go, as soon as they take power, they start taking over lands that were owned by, well, one that was private property, private Cuban property, some of it that was United States property. Their argument would have probably been that this was wealth, that this was private property that was ill-gotten, that was gotten in the time of Batista. But they they did it in a broad sweep. So they took over a lot of private land, a lot of private property, which also led to people thinking that, hey, this is not just a nationalist revolution, this is also a communist revolution. But you could also imagine that once they take over, there's this huge migration of Cubans to the United States, and it's primarily middle class, upper middle class Cubans, educated Cubans, who are really afraid of what Fidel Castro is doing in terms of taking over private land, taking people's property. So you start having this Cuban exiled community really focused around Florida and mainly Miami, and they're still there. And they're very unhappy with this Fidel Castro character right over here. So when we fast forward into 1961, John F. Kennedy he gets elected in 1960, becomes president in early 1961. We're now fast forwarding to April 1961. So John F. Kennedy has only been president for a few months. But you can imagine on a lot of levels, you have all of these Cuban exiles, upper middle class, educated, middle class Cuban exiles who hate Fidel Castro. He's taking over their land. He's turning it into looks like a leftist state. This is all happening within the context of the Cold War. The United States is afraid of countries falling to communism. It looks like Fidel Castro is a communist. So the United States, besides the fact that you have all of these exiles who want to oust him, the United States probably wants to oust him just because he's a communist, and they're afraid that he's going to align himself with the Soviet Union. So, in conjunction with the Cuban exiles and the CIA, and this right here is the director of Central Intelligence during the Kennedy administration, or at least the beginning part of the Kennedy administration. This is Allen Dulles. His brother is John Foster Dulles. That Dulles Airport is named after, and he was a U.S. Secretary of State. They decide that they want to oust Fidel Castro, but they want to do it in a way. They wanted to do it in a way that the United States does not look like it's the one doing the invasion. So what they do is they plan an invasion where they'll take Cuban exiles, and they get 1,400 men to sign up. So 1,400 exiled Cubans to sign up to be kind of part of this CIA-backed, US-backed force to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. And a lot of this was based on the premise, and you can imagine this, and this even happened in the Iraq War, where the CIA, the American president, they kind of surround themselves with people who tell them, one, give them a very optimistic scenario, a very hopeful scenario, telling them, look, we represent what the rest of the Cuban people want. They'll say, look, if we just start a revolution, Fidel Castro will be overthrown. The reality that came out, at least at that point in time, in the early 1960s, Fidel Castro was actually pretty popular with the Cuban people, and you can imagine he was at that time pretty popular with the poor people who did not have land. And now all of a sudden you have this I guess you could call him leader for the people. And I don't know about his popularity now, but at that point he was probably a lot more popular than the exiles and the CIA would have had Kennedy believe. And so they plan this attack. Kennedy says, oh, if we can get rid of Fidel Castro, then that de-risks the possibility of having this communist nation right off of the Florida coast. So they planned this invasion, and it's shady to begin with because they didn't want to make it look like an official U.S. invasion. They wanted to make it look like it was a pure Cuban counter-revolutionary, and to some degree that really kind of mixed up everything and made it look and it really was suspect because they really were doing something that was not what it really was. But the invasion, the way it all worked out is that by April 15th, and this is just going into the details of the invasion. So they had the 1,400 exiles. They had some ships, some planes. They marked them. They either removed the markings so that it didn't look like they were American ships or planes, or they put false markings of the Cuban military so that it would cause some confusion or whatever. And so on April 15th, 1961, and remember this is only a few months into Kennedy's administration, they start air attacks, and these air attacks launch from Nicaragua, and they go to Cuba. And the whole point of these air attacks are to kind of soften the Cuban Air Force for an eventual invasion by the 1,400 exiles. And so you have 8 aircraft, 8 bombers leaving Nicaragua. They bomb They bomb Cuba at a base outside of Havana and a base near the south, actually not too far from current Guantanamo Bay. And the point, and their goal was to destroy the Cuban Air Force. It turns out they didn't do it. And once again, they did it to kind of cause confusion. They did it under the markings not of U.S. bombers, but they put Cuban Air Force markings on the planes to cause confusion. You had 8 planes going and doing the bombings. One of them gets shot down, and a 9th plane actually leaves from Nicaragua, and they falsely put bullet holes in it to look like it was hit with anti-aircraft guns, and had it defect to Florida. So I guess the idea behind this was to make it look like there's a Cuban pilot who takes off from Cuba or somehow gets out of Cuba with a Cuban plane. That's why they put the markings there, and then tries to destroy a bunch of Cuban aircraft and then defects to the United States. That's the impression that they wanted to convey. It's not so clear that the Cubans actually fell for it. And so that happened in 1961. Most everyone kind of saw this as a U.S. attack, or at least said they viewed it as a U.S. attack. And then you fast forward to the night of April 16th, which I haven't written over here. April 16th. And this whole time, everyone was expecting a U.S. attack, and this is one of the things that it all gets. It all leads to the fact this was not a well orchestrated series of events. Is that it's pretty well established that some of these exiles, were just not as tight-lipped as they should have been about the invasion. It got out. It got to Soviet intelligence. The Cubans knew that an invasion was imminent. So on April 16th, you have kind of a false attack, a decoy attack at Bahia Honda right over here, which really just a bunch of decoy boats with loudspeakers on them that made it sound like they were firing and to cause confusion. And it did temporarily cause Castro to look in that direction, because they were kind of on hair trigger notice, expecting an imminent invasion, but that wasn't the real one. This was on the evening of April 16th. But then when you go to the early morning of April 17th, you have the real invasion, where you have the 1,400 Cuban exiles with CIA and U.S. military support, but all of that was hidden, to actually invade at the Bay of Pigs. And this right here is the Bay of Pigs. And to make a long story short, it was kind of the invasion did not go well, and it has been blamed on bad planning, on incompetence on some parts of the invasion. If the invasion lasted from April 17th, this was the first day of the invasion, but by April 19th, essentially the invading force, the counter-revolutionary force, the 1,400 Cuban exiles, had been pushed back to the beaches. And for the most part, a little over 100 of them were killed, and most of them, over 1,000 of them, were captured. So over 1,000 captured. And then later on in the year, Fidel Castro, and some were executed after being captured, but later on in the year, Fidel Castro makes a deal with the United States where he hands over the captured exiles to the United States in exchange for $58 million in aid and supplies and all the rest. So this, at least from a military point of view, was a complete debacle from the United States point of view. And when you could imagine after this happened, people in the United States started pointing fingers. You have the CIA, and this is Allen Dulles right here, and the exiles blaming the Kennedy administration, saying that, look, he wasn't willing to do what it takes to actually do a proper invasion. He wasn't willing to provide the proper air support once the invasion started happening. He wasn't willing to commit more U.S. troops once the invasion started looking like it wasn't going in the direction of the exiles. Kennedy, on the other hand, blames the CIA. He says, look, this was just done. This was planned incompetently. And he also says that you gave me all sorts of misinformation. You told me that once the invasion started, that there was all sorts of resentment against Fidel Castro, and it would cause this broader uprising, which never ever happened. And so this is actually a quote from John F. Kennedy, that he said after the Bay of Pigs invasion: "The first advice I'm going to give my successors to watch the generals and to avoid feeling that because they were military men, their opinions on military matters were worth a damn." This is John F. Kennedy saying this after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, you can dig deeper and figure out who probably was in the right here. But the bottom line is that it led to all around negative consequences for the United States. After this, after this, it kind of strengthened Fidel Castro's hold on Cuba. He was like, hey, that was the United States' best shot. Huge embarrassment for them. It allowed him to concentrate his control. It also caused him to now become very openly communist. And also, he was now, before the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was kind of trying to get the U.S. to somewhat like him, although they wouldn't like him because he was taking over private property and he was clearly left-leaning. But after the Bay of Pigs invasion, he definitely aligned himself closely with the Soviet Union. He became much more open about being a Marxist-Leninist communist state. And because he was afraid of future U.S. invasions, he was open to what eventually leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the Soviet Union actually placing ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads in Cuba at short range to the United States. So it set up this whole series of events that really didn't work in the U.S.'s favor. Before we go into the details of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's important to understand the world's environment entering into October of 1962. In 1959, you have a revolution in Cuba led by Fidel Castro, and he is heading the Communist Party there. Cuba is now a communist nation right off of the coast of the United States. This is the middle of the Cold War. The United States believes in a strategy of containment, does not like this. So in 1961, the United States, the CIA, the Kennedy administration, they try using Cuban exiles, people who had left Cuba. They try to support them to enter and invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. But the whole effort wasn't planned properly. The support for the Cuban exiles, the counter-revolutionaries, those that were trying to oust Castro, it was kind of this half-hearted effort, and it was this big failure. So the Bay of Pigs invasion was a failure in 1961, and it made John F. Kennedy seem a little bit weak. It made the CIA seem, it didn't make anyone on the American side look all that competent because of that failure. On top of that, we're in the middle of the Cold War. Remember this. And at the same time, if you go to what the U.S. was doing around the Soviet Union, it started placing missiles starting in the late 50s all the way into 1961 and 1962. It started placing medium-ranged ballistic missiles in Turkey and in Italy. These are where they were located. And the significance of that is that now these missiles could reach the major population centers of the Soviet Union in really a matter of minutes, in 10 to 20 minutes. I think 16 minutes was how long most of these stay airborne. And when in a situation where both sides have nuclear weapons, there was this kind of notion of, well, maybe if you were able to get to the other guy faster, they wouldn't be able to retaliate, and maybe you wouldn't have that mutually assured destruction. So there's this whole idea that you want to get your missiles as close as possible so that they could reach the population centers, the strategic centers of your opponent as quickly as possible. And if you look up on the web, you can actually find the actual missile sites and when they were installed and when they became operational. These are the ones that were in Italy, kind of right here near the heel of Italy. So you have this environment. The United States was looking a little bit weak after the Bay of Pigs invasion. It looks like they wanted to oust Castro, but they did it slightly, or they weren't able to do it, and they weren't able because they were slightly inept. And at the same time, you could imagine that the Soviet Union did not appreciate the United States placing these missiles so close to its population centers, missiles that could reach its population centers very easily. So now we fast forward to October of 1962, and the entire Cuban Missile Crisis will occur over 13 or 14 days during October of 1962. So on the 14th of October, we're sending these U-2 spy planes over Cuba. So this right here is a U-2 spy plane. That is a U-2 spy plane. And it takes pictures that look like this. And then the next day on October 15th, you have the CIA analysts, and they're saying, wow, that looks like missiles over there. This looks like ballistic missiles that are being set up in Cuba. And so all of a sudden, it looks like the Soviet Union is using Cuba to do the same thing that we used Turkey and Italy for, to set up ballistic missiles really right off of our coast, and ballistic missiles that could now reach any of the strategic population centers, especially on the East Coast or the Midwest of the United States. So by the 16th, so this is literally 2 days after the pictures were taken. The next day they're analyzing them. They tell the State Department about them. The 16th, they tell Kennedy about them, and Kennedy holds a meeting of the Executive Committee. And it wasn't called XCOM, just that, but it was really a subset of special advisors, a subset of the National Security Council and other advisors that essentially become the brain trust to figure out what to do about this forming crisis. Because all of a sudden, you have a state that we don't like off of our borders, a communist state, a state aligned with the Soviet Union. All of a sudden, it has nuclear missiles. It looks like these are offensive weapons. These are weapons being designed for a first strike capability. Once again, if they're being launched from Cuba, maybe they can attack, maybe they can obliterate the U.S. before the U.S. even has an opportunity to respond properly. So this really freaks out the Kennedy administration. And so they start to think about what can they do about it. And early on, there's a couple. You could just kind of call and talk to the Soviets about it and say, hey, we don't like that. Why don't you undo your missiles? But they didn't really think that that would have any significant effect on the Soviets, especially because they probably thought that Kennedy was weak at this point. And just to understand who was leading the Soviets at this time, it was Khrushchev. This is Khrushchev right over here. And he had even made remarks to the effect that he thought that Kennedy was young and maybe naive and maybe too intellectual to really play a good game of chicken here. And so the U.S. kind of felt that it had to look strong here. And so the real options on the table were maybe blockade Cuba. And so a blockade could be an all-out blockade, so it would be an economic blockade, but that's actually considered an act of war because you're to a large degree starving a country. Another option for the United States, because it was completely viewed as unacceptable that these missiles should be here and that they should be deployable from Cuba. The other option would be to do air attacks on these missile silos. And then the other, kind of the most extreme action would be to actually invade Cuba. And obviously that goes in line with kind of the US's general interest of not having a communist regime so close to its own borders. So this is what Kennedy and his team was wrestling with. And really early on in these early days, most of the team was actually advising Kennedy that they should do a full-scale invasion of Cuba, that they thought this was the only thing that the Soviets would take seriously. It would show that the U.S. is serious about this. And they didn't think that the Soviet Union would really try to put up a fight in Cuba so far away from their own borders. But Kennedy, probably thinking about it pretty reasonably, realized, well, hey, they might not do anything in Cuba, and they might allow us to oust Castro and install a new regime there, but they might retaliate. In fact, they probably would retaliate in Europe, and specifically in Berlin, probably in Germany as a whole. So just for the sake of getting these things out of Cuba, we could sacrifice a lot in Europe, and even more, any type of conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union could easily escalate to a nuclear war. So these were all on the table. The U.S. goes on high alert. It prepares for any of these situations because they really don't know what's going to happen. The Army, the Air Force, and the Navy starts mobilizing. So on kind of, with hours' notice, any of those options can kind of go into effect. By the 22nd, you have the Executive Committee, and that just becomes formalized as an actual official group that is advising the president in this capacity. And on the 22nd, Kennedy finally puts out his first salvo on what is the U.S.'s position on what's going on here. And before this, and just to make things clear, on the 18th, he did meet with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, and I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciations. And this is where the first time that Kennedy's like, hey, you've got these offensive weapons, and Gromyko's insisting that no, they're just defensive weapons. And to most people, defensive weapons would mean things like surface-to-air missiles, things that would stop planes from bombings, but not surface-to-surface missiles, not something that could attack a country. But we'll see in future letters from Khrushchev that maybe they actually did perceive these missiles as somehow being defensive. But you fast forward, that was on the 18th. It kind of made Kennedy and the U.S. frustrated with the Russians because it felt like, the Americans are saying, look, we clearly know you have missiles there, but Gromyko's saying, no, these are just defensive weapons, nothing to worry about. Why are you taking this so seriously? The 19th, U.S. goes on high alert. It starts thinking about all of these options. The 22nd, this committee is formed formally, but more importantly, Kennedy gives a speech to state the United States' opinion, and I'll just read it right here. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba from whatever nation or port will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers. We are not at this time, however, denying the necessities of life as the Soviets attempted to do in their Berlin blockade of 1948. So the Kennedy administration's position became slightly more nuanced. They said we can't do an all-out blockade. One, that is an act of war. Two, that is to a large degree inhumane. Why should we starve the Cuban people? What we're going to do is kind of a filter on the cargo going into Cuba. We will only inspect things that we suspect are holding armaments, and we will only turn back the ships that are actually doing it. But then on the 24th, there's a cable from Khrushchev, and it says, if you coolly weigh the situation which has developed, not giving way to passions, you will understand that the Soviet Union cannot fail to reject the arbitrary demands of the United States, and that the Soviet Union views the blockade as an act of aggression, and that their ships will be instructed to ignore it. So the game of chicken is beginning to emerge. The United States is just saying, look, this is unacceptable. We're going to stop you from shipping arms to Cuba. On the 24th, Khrushchev is saying, who are you to tell us what to do? And there's this kind of undercurrent of like, wait, you've already got stuff set up in Italy and Turkey, not too far from us. How can you dare, and they call it a blockade, even though the U.S. is calling it a quarantine. This is an act of aggression, and we will ignore it. So both parties are kind of saying, we don't care what you're going to do. We're going to do whatever we have to do. And this whole time, I mean, both sides are getting tense. The whole world is kind of taking sides here, making public statements about what's right or wrong. So we really are getting very close to the brink of a very major confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. And there's, you can read the book 13 Days, Robert Kennedy. There's also the movie 13 Days, which actually is not based on the book. But both of them really kind of give the account of what happened over this period. But then you fast forward to the 25th, and Kennedy essentially replies that, look, these are offensive weapons, and these require the responses I have announced. I hope that your government will take necessary action to permit restoration of the earlier situation. So Kennedy's saying, look, we have to do this. These are offensive weapons. We cannot tolerate these weapons so close to U.S. borders. And so also on the 25th, the quarantine's in effect. It does get challenged. The U.S. does start to inspect some ships. They tried to inspect one ship that got away a little bit, and the Soviets did. So the Soviets, even though they're speaking the game of chicken, they are turning back. They did turn back 14 ships, and the best guess is that those 14 ships probably did contain some type of armament. So even though publicly everyone is playing a very strong game, behind the scenes there is a little bit of a softening of the stance. And then you fast forward to the 26th, and Khrushchev essentially sends his first proposal. And it's interesting here because in Khrushchev's mind, and this is a fascinating letter to read. It's a fairly long letter, so I'm not going to go into the whole thing, and you can get it at this URL right over here. It's a fascinating letter. Maybe I'll do a whole video where I just read this letter. He kind of goes into the nuance of what he views as a defensive or an offensive weapons. He implicitly admits that they have that the missiles are there, that they're not these benign weapons. But he, in his letter, he kind of makes the nuance that he views them as defensive weapons. He says, look, you guys attempted to oust Castro already. We view Castro as an ally. We think that by placing these weapons here, you will be less likely to be able to oust Castro because you will be afraid of these weapons. So Khrushchev is kind of setting up, Khrushchev's saying we don't have any intention of using these to attack you for no reason. We're just putting these here to essentially defend one of our allies. So he's saying that's the reason that they placed those weapons there in the first place. Kind of saying, look, you did Bay of Pigs. You were the ones that took the first shot. Now we are defending it. That might have been the rationale. Another rationale for why they did it is just, and probably the more strategic rationale, is that we already did have these missiles that were pointed at the Soviet Union in Turkey and Italy, and the Soviet Union just wanted to have parity, so they wanted to put missiles on near the U.S. on some allies' country from the Soviet Union's point of view. So on the 26th, Khrushchev's first proposal that was given through a cable says, if assurances were given by the President and the government of the United States that the USA itself would not participate, so assurances, let me underline this in a different color. Assurances that the USA itself would not participate in an attack on Cuba and would restrain others from actions of this sort, probably the Cuban exiles. If you would recall your fleet, this would immediately change everything. I am not speaking for Fidel Castro, but I think that he and the government of Cuba evidently would declare demobilization and would appeal to the people to get down to peaceful labor. Then to the question, the communists always like talking about labor. Then to the question of armaments would disappear, since if there is no threat, then armaments are a burden for every people. So in this first proposal that came over a cable, he's essentially saying, look, if you guys just promise not to attack Cuba, if you just make assurances that you will not attack Cuba, then we'll essentially undo everything. We'll give in to your wishes. And this stance right here really does make it look like their main interest in having those missiles was kind of to protect Cuba, so that the U.S. would not try to oust the communists from there. But then on the next day, Khrushchev has a broadcast, a public broadcast, where he kind of changes his tone a little bit. Now he's saying that they would undo the situation in Cuba only if the United States removed their missiles from Italy and Turkey. So he's sending a little mixed messages. His first message was kind of a softer stance. Look, you guys just promised not to invade Cuba, and we're going to pull out of Cuba. The second stance is saying, no, we're only going to take our missiles out of Cuba if you take your missiles out of Italy and Turkey. And on the same day, another U-2 spy plane gets shot down over Cuba. And this is when both armies are really at kind of, they're like hair trigger notice. So it's a really scary situation. And this was actually it was a local decision by a Soviet commander. And Khrushchev actually did not want this to happen. And lucky for I guess the world, the U.S. did not use this alone as a reason to engage in war. They said maybe it's an accident. If this happens again, then we'll use it as war. So it was lucky that this did not trigger an immediate war with the Soviets. But the Kennedy administration still had the question: which of these was the more serious? Which of these requests were the Soviets really making? This is a more significant request. Are they requesting for both? And so it was eventually decided on the 27th that, hey, let's just pretend like we didn't even know, that the Americans didn't even know about the second request that asked for more, and let's just reply to this first request. So you essentially have Kennedy agreeing to Khrushchev and saying, okay, we'll do your first request. We will agree not to invade Cuba if you remove your missiles. And then essentially what happens, and that puts Khrushchev in a weird situation, because this is something that he did recommend, but they were ignoring this over here. But through back channels, we said we'll officially agree to this, but through back channels, the Kennedy administration said, and we would also be on an understanding. We would also have an understanding on the missiles in Italy and Turkey, that, look, this isn't part of the deal, but we see what you're saying, and we're probably going to remove them. And what the Soviets also didn't know at that time is that the Americans were planning on that these missiles, to a large degree, by this point in time, were already obsolete, because we already had Polaris missiles that were deployable by submarines, and clearly submarines can deploy things much closer to the action, and they're much harder to track. You can't surveil them and all the rest. So the U.S. kind of agreed to it, but they did it secretly. And the whole point here is that neither side wanted to look like they're giving in. Neither side wanted to look weak. But on the 28th, there was finally an agreement, and so publicly, the first Khrushchev proposal was agreed to by both Khrushchev and the United States. Khrushchev agreed to not send any more weapons, and also dismantle the weapons that were there. And the Americans agreed that they would not invade Cuba. And so you can imagine the big winner here is probably Fidel Castro, because the whole time he's paranoid that the U.S. is planning another attack on him, and at least publicly now they're saying that they cannot invade, and if they did, it would look like they're going back on their word. And privately, the U.S. agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey and Italy. They didn't want to do this publicly, because then it would look like they're being weak. Then it would look like the Soviets were able to do this aggressive action, and by doing it, they were able to extract something out of the United States, which is actually the reality. They were able to. By doing this action, they were able to get these missiles removed from Turkey and Italy. But the United States wanted to look strong. Kennedy has, there's always an approaching election. He had, especially after the Bay of Pigs, he needed to look like a strong leader. And so, to some degree, you have to give Khrushchev credit for this. He kind of swallowed his pride and allowed it to publicly look like he lost the negotiation. He publicly made it look like he got nothing in return for backing down, but in reality, he did. He just didn't necessarily get credit for it. But this was a big deal because this was the closest that the Soviet Union and the U.S. ever got to really the brink during the Cold War. In order to have a respectable understanding of the Vietnam War, we have to rewind all the way back to the late 1800s when France was colonizing Southeast Asia. And in particular, it colonized what is now Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And they were collectively called French Indochina. You can see Cambodia here, Vietnam along the coast, and then Laos right over here. And France stayed the colonizing power. I have a little gap in my timeline here. And they stayed a colonizing power all the way through World War II. And so you can imagine during World War II, France was quickly overrun by the Germans. The Vietnamese wanted their independence. And so you have a liberation movement that rises up, and it was led by the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh were led by Ho Chi Minh. And this right here is a picture. This right here is a picture of Ho Chi Minh. And besides being a liberation movement, they were also communist. They were also communists, which you could imagine later on during the Cold War will kind of bias the United States against them. But you fast forward through World War II. Eventually, the Japanese take control over Indochina, over Vietnam. But by the time 45 rolls about, or at least the end of 45, and we know that the United States defeats Japan, now all of a sudden the Viet Minh are able to declare a somewhat temporary independence. And it's temporary because shortly after that, and the region is occupied temporarily by the Chinese in the north and the British in the south, who were part of the Allied forces against the Axis. But eventually you have the French coming back, and they want to reassert their control over their former colony. And you have this war that develops, the First Indochina War, between the French and the people sympathetic to the French, the Vietnamese who are loyal to the French, and the North. And the French, and just to make it clear how it sets up, when at the end of World War II, when you had the temporary occupiers, the British and the Chinese obviously had more influence in the north, the British had more influence in the south. When the French come back, they essentially are able to reinstate control over the south. So right when the Indochina War is beginning, the French already have more control over the south. And actually, historically, the French had more influence in the south as well. During French colonial rule, it was really the southern third of Vietnam where you had a lot of French influence. And this is a current map, and the current map does not have this orange boundary over here that we'll talk about in a second. It's all Vietnam is now unified. But before the Vietnam War, this was not Ho Chi Minh City. This was Saigon. And Saigon was kind of where most of the French control was centered. But you fast forward to 1954, this ends up in a bit of a stalemate. And so you have the Geneva Conference of 1954 that partitions Vietnam along the 17th parallel between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And the whole point of this partition was really to just allow for a cooling off period, a period where you can have things settling down and then having elections. It wasn't meant to be a permanent partition. But there was a 300-day period where people could move across the partition. And during that partition, you actually had 900,000 people, mainly Catholics, move from the north to south. You also had several 100,000 people moving from the south to the north. So it wasn't a one-way movement, but net, most of the movement by Roman Catholic Vietnamese was from the north to the south. You fast forward a little bit, you eventually have, and I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation here, Ngo Dinh Diem take control. He starts off as prime minister in 54. Eventually he takes control, becomes president in 55. This is him right here. He takes control of South Vietnam. And this guy is not a big fan of things like elections or non-corrupt government and all of the rest. And he takes control of South Vietnam. But you can imagine that the United States is positively inclined to him. One, he dresses in nice Western suits and all of that, and nicely combed hair. But he was also anti-communist. And at this time period, the United States is starting to think in terms of Cold War, in terms of how do we stop communism? How do we contain it? This whole theory of containment, that the best way to stop the Soviet Union is to just make sure that communism can not spread, that it gets contained. That we have the domino theory in the United States, that if one country falls to communism in a region, that the rest of the countries will eventually fall, and that is not good for containment. So we did not want South Vietnam to fall. We essentially start supporting these characters over here. And even from the early 50s, the United States starts supporting the anti-communists. And at first, this support, it's in the, I guess we should say, the guise of advisors. But these advisors, one, we start sending more and more aid, more and more advisors, and these advisors start getting more and more involved in the actual conflict. And so after this partition, you can imagine that you still have an ongoing conflict between the North and the South. And on top of that, you have actors who are sympathetic to the North, sympathetic to the Viet Minh, sympathetic to Ho Chi Minh in the South. Some of them were in the North, they come back to the South. Some of them were just in the South. And they did not like the Diem government. Besides just being sympathetic to Ho Chi Minh, Diem was a fairly corrupt, autocratic ruler who wasn't a big fan of democracy. And so these players in the South who started to rise up against President Diem were the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong. And so this really sets up what the Vietnam War is all about. You have the communist Ho Chi Minh controlled North that was fighting a conventional war against the South. You have this partition on the 17th parallel, and on top of that, you have an unconventional fighting force, I guess you could call them guerrillas, in the south of Vietnam called the Viet Cong. So it was kind of a double. There are two things that the South had to fight against: the North officially, and also this insurrection that was occurring within the South. And so the whole time, the United States did not want this insurrection to succeed. They did not want all of Vietnam to become communist. We keep sending more and more advisors. It actually started even before Kennedy, but in Kennedy he starts sending, he escalates the number of advisors that get sent. It's still not, at this point, it's still not a formal war. We haven't officially declared war. We don't have officially soldiers in battle. You fast forward to 1963. Besides all of the great characteristics of Diem that I already mentioned, he also was into persecuting Buddhists. So to make matters worse, so not only was he corrupt, not only did he not like elections, but he liked persecuting his own people. And by 1963, this kind of got out of hand. His level of persecution of the Buddhists, he started storming temples and all the rest. And so he was assassinated. And not only was he's assassinated, it kind of leaves this power vacuum. You have all of these people jockeying for control. None of these really especially savory characters inside the South. These two guys eventually come to power, Nguyen Cao Khai and Nguyen Van Tu. Wait a few years, Nguyen Van Tu is able to get this guy out of the picture, and then by 1967, I don't have it over here, 1967, you have Tu has now taken control. But during that period, or actually before Khai and Tu take power, in 1964 you have one of the shadiest incidents in American history. As you can imagine, we, as in our function as advisors, we had sent ships into the Gulf of Tonkin, right off of the coast of North Vietnam. And so the original story goes, and this is a very suspect original story, in 1964, the U.S. Maddox, and this is the original story, claimed that it was attacked, or it was claimed that the U.S. Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats, and that there was there was a little bit of a skirmish, there was an exchange of fire. And it was also claimed that a few days later, another boat in the Gulf of Tonkin, another U.S. vessel, was attacked by a North Vietnamese boat. That was the original story. This angered Congress. This angered the American people. How dare they attack ships that are sitting off of the coast, warships that are sitting off the coast? And so this kind of gave the emotional fuel to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So these incidents, or these purported incidents, this kind of attack on the USS Maddox and this other thing that might have happened, these were called the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. This angered Congress, angered the American people, so we passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And what's relevant about it is that it gave LBJ here, it gave him the authority to officially engage in a war in Vietnam, to officially escalate it to an actual war that the U.S. was involved in. And this whole time I've been saying it's shady because it's now been shown that, one, the Gulf of Tonkin, well, it's not clear that really anything happened. There might have been some firing from the USS Maddox. They might have actually engaged the North Vietnamese patrol boats. The other possibility that might have happened is that nothing happened. So, but either way, any way you look at it, it's now been fairly established that it was not a real incident. It was not really North Vietnam attacking the United States. But it was relevant because it really escalated the war. So now you have Johnson. And did I say North Korea originally? I apologize for that. We're talking about North Vietnam. I don't remember what my brain actually said. Of course, North Vietnam. But it gave Johnson the power to escalate the war, and so his administration is really the heart of the Vietnam War. When the war was really escalated, we eventually get to 500,000 U.S. troops. But the whole time this is happening, you can imagine that Johnson and the military leaders and the American military leaders in Vietnam are telling the American people, "Oh, we're fighting communism. We're about to win. This is a noble war." And you fast forward, and especially the part about to win, you fast forward to 1968, and all of a sudden you have the Viet Cong, who the American leaders have told the American people in the Congress that they're about to be defeated. And then in 1968, the Viet Cong orchestrate the Tet Offensive, which is this massive coordinated attack on a bunch of targets throughout South Vietnam. And so even though it wasn't completely successful militarily, the intent of the Tet Offensive was to kind of completely turn the tides in the war. It made the American people and Congress rightfully suspicious. Mr. Johnson, you had told us that we were about to win the war, and we were about to, the Viet Cong were almost defeated, and all of a sudden they orchestrate this sophisticated attack on us. It rightfully made the American public suspicious. On top of that, and this probably made matters a lot worse, the My Lai massacre comes out. And in every war there are massacres, but the United States at least believes that its soldiers can kind of take the high road, that they don't engage in these type of things. But the My Lai massacre showed that really no soldiers are immune to massacres, and this is really a disgusting massacre, and it was documented. And if you really want to be disturbed, do a Google search for images of the My Lai massacre. It will ruin your weekend. It'll depress you. It's U.S. soldiers killing a village of innocent women and children. There's pictures of dead babies. It's horrible. And on top of, to make matters worse, or even add insult to injury, the soldiers who committed it, there was actually a few who tried to defend the villagers, and they were when they came back, they were treated almost like traitors. But the soldiers who actually did the attack, only one of them got jail time, and it was only a couple of years of jail time. And this is for massacring a village of women and children. So already you had the Tet Offensive, makes the American public suspicious of whether we can even win this war, and then you have the My Lai massacre, which just disgusts the public and makes people realize that we're involved in a war that not even clear who are the good guys anymore, not even clear what the real goals are. Make matters worse, you fast forward to 1971, the Pentagon Papers get leaked to the New York Times, and these pretty much articulate, it's a classified document that articulates that the leadership, the military and non-military leadership of the Vietnam War was to some degree lying to Congress and the American people. It was lying about how the war was going. It was lying about what activities it was doing. It did not tell the American people and Congress that it was actually engaged in war in Laos and Cambodia. And a lot of the reason why we were engaged in Laos and Cambodia is because that's where the supply routes were between the North and the South. They ran through Laos and Cambodia. And the most famous of them, and you might have heard of it, is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And it wasn't just one trail, it was actually a network of trails. And so a lot of the activity that was going on in Laos and Cambodia was kind of carpet bombing of what the U.S. thought were some of these supply routes, and we never really got a good, well, that's a whole other debate. But it wasn't just one trail that was easily bombed. It was all of these little footpaths and all of these other things where arms were able to be transported from the north to the south. But the Pentagon Papers rightfully made the American people even more suspicious. And then now we're entering into Nixon's administration, and he was still doing the carpet bombing, still atrocities going on. But his whole goal was to kind of wind down the war, bring the troops out on a timetable without kind of an official defeat. So you fast forward to 1973, you have the Paris Peace Accords, where officially there is peace between the North, the South, the North, and the Americans. You can imagine it from the North's point of view. They're like, sure, we'll sign some peace accords. It'll just make the Americans go away. Once the Americans go away, they won't be able to come back. Since this was such a hugely unpopular war, it was such a waste for America on so many dimensions, especially America's prestige as a global actor. We'll just wait for them to leave, and then we can overrun the South after that. And that's essentially what happens. In 1975, the North just overruns the South, and then later that year you have Saigon falling to the north, and then it becomes Ho Chi Minh City. And just this whole period, you have President Tu is in power, and just to show where his priorities are, right near the end, right when the North is falling to South Vietnam, and you can kind of see the writing on the wall, he gives a speech to the Vietnamese people saying that he'll never desert them. But then when he really makes it, when it becomes pretty clear that Saigon is going to fall to the North Vietnamese, he gets on a big U.S. transport plane with literally 15 tons of luggage. 15 tons of luggage. I'll let you think about how much luggage that is, and $15 million worth of gold. And this is $15 million worth of gold in 1975. So you can imagine how much he really cared about the Vietnamese people. And he eventually ends up settling in Massachusetts, and he died there in about 10 years ago. So you can imagine this was an ugly incident for the world, super ugly incident for the Vietnamese people, a super ugly chapter in American history. It was the first war that America lost, but more, it hurts prestige. It hurts America's ability to influence what was going on in other parts of the world. You had the containment theory that we had to stop communism from spreading, and the domino theory that if one country would fall to communism, then the other one would. That didn't happen. The South did fall, but we didn't have the rest of Southeast Asia falling to communism. So it kind of disproved the domino theory, especially because after the Vietnam War, the United States would not be able to enter another war like it for some time because the American people wouldn't let it happen. So to some degree, it would have been easier for communism to spread because people would have known that the U.S. couldn't engage it. But despite that, the domino theory didn't happen. But it was just all around ugly. I mean, besides the massacres and the raping and the pillaging of innocents that happened on all sides of this, you have 1 to 3 million Vietnamese, and no one will really know the actual count, but that's a huge number. 1 to 3 million Vietnamese were killed. You have 58,000 American troops being killed. American troops. And you have hundreds of thousands of Cambodians and Laotians who were never really formally involved in the war. They were killed, especially due to a lot of this carpet bombing campaign. So these are I mean, just atrocious numbers, and really one of the worst and ugliest chapters in U.S. history.
The era from 1945 to 1980 was action-packed, to say the least. During this period, the United States experienced the baby boom, the civil rights movement, the tumultuous 1960s, and the quagmire of Vietnam. This era was also riddled with contradictions. A sense of optimism in the future and a conviction that American economic prosperity was endless was tempered by fears of nuclear annihilation and a war on poverty. A foreign policy based on democracy and anti-communism abroad was undermined by the suppression of civil rights and civil liberties at home. Material comforts and Leave It to Beaver visions of suburbia clashed with growing calls for young people to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Would the generation that fought World War II even recognize the generation that protested Vietnam? That's the question I'd like to explore in this video, taking a high-level look at the impact the events of the post-war era had on reshaping American national identity. How much did American national identity change, and how much did it stay the same over this time period? To answer this question, first we have to define what we mean by American national identity. In other videos, we've looked at a few aspects of American identity as core ideological beliefs about things like who counts as an American, whether the United States is exceptional, or whether it's possible for anyone to succeed so long as they work hard enough. So if we're trying to track continuity and change in American identity over the period from 1945 to 1980, what might be a few beliefs we should trace over time? I encourage you to pause the video and see if you can come up with a couple based on your knowledge of the events in this time period. Some big events that jump out to me are the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, as well as the protests of the 1960s. So with that in mind, the core beliefs I'd like to look at are ideas about the United States' role in the world, who counts as an American citizen, and the country's cultural values. You might have come up with a totally different set of beliefs, which is great. Try out this same process I'm about to model using the beliefs that you've chosen. Now that we've got a few aspects of national identity we want to track, let's compare each of them at the beginning of this period to the end of this period. Remember, we're doing a super high-level overview here, so I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to explain events in detail. But if something comes up that you're unfamiliar with, just make a note and you can look it up when you've got time. All right, let's see what changed and what stayed the same over this period in beliefs about the United States' role in the world. In 1945, the United States emerged as a world superpower, having abandoned isolationism as a foreign policy. Instead, the United States became a leading member of the United Nations and the NATO Defensive Pact. The U.S. government was determined to contain the spread of communism and the influence of the Soviet Union through providing military and financial support to nations fighting communism, which would lead to American military engagements in Korea and Vietnam. The United States also had a lot of confidence in its economic role in the world, as the only country whose industrial might hadn't been compromised by World War II bombings. Immediately after the war, the United States was the world's leading exporter of steel, cars, consumer goods, and oil. How does that compare to beliefs about America's proper role in the world in 1980? Well, the United States was still a world superpower at the end of this era, and it was still pursuing anti-communism as a foreign policy. But in the 1970s, the Cold War entered a period of détente, a relaxation of tensions and increase in cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. You could see this as the U.S. government accepting peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. This approach will change when Ronald Reagan comes into office in 1981, but the period of détente lasted until the end of the 1970s. The Vietnam War shook American confidence in its interventionist foreign policy. After the war, there was more reluctance to commit U.S. troops abroad, in what's been called Vietnam Syndrome. Likewise, the Nixon Doctrine called for U.S. allies to take primary responsibility for their own defense. Lastly, U.S. economic world dominance was threatened in the late 1970s as well, as Japanese and German automobile makers began competing internationally, and the energy-dependent United States found that its energy needs were increasingly tied to the oil-exporting countries of the Middle East. So in terms of what changed and what stayed the same from the beginning to the end of the post-war era, I would say that although the United States remained a world superpower committed to supporting its allies and opposing the spread of communism, by the end of the 1970s, the country looked to establish some limits to its intervention in world affairs. Next, let's look at how beliefs about citizenship changed during this period. After the shared experience of GIs in World War II, European immigrants who had been looked upon as dangerous others in the 1920s and 1930s were accepted as U.S. citizens and categorized as simply white, not Polish or Irish or Russian. But African American soldiers who had served in segregated units during the war weren't afforded the same courtesy. Despite Truman's executive order desegregating the military in 1948, Black veterans encountered racial discrimination after the war, along with difficulty accessing the government subsidies for education and home loans that white GIs took advantage of. The immigration restrictions that set national origin quotas in the 1920s were still largely intact, although the Chinese Exclusion Act had been repealed during the war as China was a U.S. ally. Chinese Americans were then eligible to become U.S. citizens. However, the new quota for Chinese immigrants was just 105 individuals per year. What were the beliefs around citizenship at the end of the post-war era? A lot changed during this time period, thanks to the Civil Rights Movement, Supreme Court decisions like Brown versus Board of Education, and legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At the end of the 60s, African Americans were able to access more citizenship rights than they ever had before. And in 1965, Congress repealed the old national origin quotas and passed new immigration laws, allowing Asians to enter the country, as well as prioritizing family reunification and the entrance of skilled immigrants. But in the late 1960s and 1970s, there was a backlash against the civil rights policies set by the Supreme Court and the Johnson administration, with many conservatives arguing that the federal intervention to advance civil rights had gone too far, and with some left-leaning organizations arguing that it hadn't gone far enough to address issues like housing and job discrimination. Looking at the changes and continuities in beliefs about citizenship over this period, I'd say there was an enormous expansion over time in who was considered a citizen or eligible to become a citizen of the United States. But there was also a growing antagonism toward the federal government intervening on behalf of civil rights. Last, let's look at American cultural values at the beginning and end of the post-war era. In the years after the war, there was an emphasis on domesticity and family life, and women were expected to give up their wartime jobs and seek fulfillment through motherhood and consumption. The United States began a post-war economic boom that looked virtually unstoppable. In fact, the American standard of living doubled in the 25 years after World War II. There was also a lot of pressure for Americans to conform to a homogeneous mass culture, idealizing the white suburban nuclear family. Fear of communist infiltrators led to witch hunts like McCarthyism, but few people questioned the wisdom of the U.S. government or authority figures in general. Compare that to the end of this period, after the tumult of the 1960s had turned American culture on its head. In the 1960s and 1970s, the sexual revolution and women's rights movement challenged the idealized nuclear family, allowing for a more permissive sexual culture and the advancement of women in jobs and education. Starting as early as the 1950s, the Beat generation began to question the emptiness of the single-minded pursuit of wealth that was the American dream. In the 1960s, students began to protest the draft and the military-industrial complex more generally, wondering what the United States was even doing in Vietnam. They vowed not to trust anyone over 30. By the 1970s, public confidence in the U.S. government was also at an all-time low, after revelations about presidential misdeeds exposed by the Pentagon Papers and the Watergate scandal. To add insult to injury, the endless economic boom finally seemed to be at an end by the 1970s, with deindustrialization and stagflation increasing prices and unemployment. So it seems like American cultural values changed a great deal from 1945 to 1980, from a culture of suburban conformity to one of greater personal freedom, but also greater cynicism. But it is important to note that the people of the United States didn't fully reject the premise of the American dream. Despite the counterculture of the 1960s, by the 1970s, most people were still looking for a good job and hoping to buy a nice home. If we return to our question then, how much did the events of the post-war era reshape American identity? I think we can respond that they reshaped it quite a bit. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the protest movements of the 1960s led to a U.S. national identity that was considerably more inclusive and socially free, but also a good deal less confident about its government or its role in the world. To see how these forces played out in the next stage of U.S. history, we'll have to look to the 1980s.